The world had reduced itself to two distinct colors, the deep, bruising indigo of the winter night and the soft, ghostly gray of the fallen snow. There was no beginning to this night, and there seemed to be no end, only a perpetual suspension in the cold, thick air that hung over the courtyard like a heavy woolen blanket. The silence was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against the high stone walls of the manor, dampening sound, absorbing the very idea of noise until the only thing that remained was the faint, rhythmic settling of the ice. It was a silence that felt ancient, a hush that had existed long before the stone was quarried and would exist long after the stone had crumbled back into the earth. In the center of this quiet expanse stood the sleigh. It was a dark shape, sketched against the darkness with heavy strokes of charcoal and slate. It did not look like a vehicle meant for travel. It looked like a piece of furniture abandoned in the wilderness, a heavy wooden box lacquered in black, sitting atop iron runners that had frozen to the ground. The lantern hanging from the side hook offered the only resistance to the overwhelming blue of the night. Its light was weak, a pale ochre smudge that barely illuminated the snow beneath it, casting long, trembling shadows that stretched out and disappeared into the void. The light did not flicker with energy. It burned with a slow, resigned consistency, turning the flakes of snow that drifted past it into brief, dying sparks of gold before they returned to the gray anonymity of the ground. The air was so cold it felt sharp, crystalline, as if breathing it in would cut the lungs with tiny shards of glass. It was a dry, hollow cold that stripped the moisture from the stone and the wood, leaving everything brittle and hard. The horses, two massive beasts of burden with coats as dark as the shadows they stood in, remained motionless. They were not impatient. They did not paw the ground or toss their manes. They simply stood, heads lowered, their breath escaping their nostrils in thick, billowing clouds of white steam that rose sluggishly and dissipated into the freezing air. Their existence was one of endurance, their bodies distinct shapes of warmth in a landscape that had forgotten the concept of heat. The leather harnesses that bound them were stiff with frost, creaking softly only when one of the animals shifted its weight from one hoof to another, a sound like old timber groaning under a heavy roof. From the dark archway of the manor, a figure emerged, the Duchess. She was not a person so much as a collection of heavy layers, a silhouette broadened and weighed down by the necessity of survival. She wore velvet the color of midnight, so dark it swallowed the faint light of the lantern, and over that a heavy cloak of rough wool, and over that furs that smelled of cedar and old chests. She moved slowly, her steps muffled by the thick layer of snow that coated the cobblestones. There was no urgency in her movement, no hurried stride to escape the biting wind, for the wind was everywhere, and the cold was a companion that walked beside her, stepped with her, and settled upon her shoulders. She approached the sleigh with the resignation of one who knows that the journey is inevitable, yet holds no promise of arrival. The snow crunched beneath her boots, a dry, compressing sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. It was the sound of winter's grip tightening. She reached out a gloved hand to touch the side of the sleigh. The wood was slick with a thin veneer of ice, cold enough to burn even through the leather of her gloves. It felt solid, immovable, a part of the frozen earth itself. The coachman, a figure wrapped so thoroughly in gray wool that he appeared faceless, a mere extension of the driver's bench, did not turn. He sat like a statue carved from ice and cloth, staring forward into the tunnel of trees that awaited them. He was part of the machinery of the night, as silent and enduring as the iron runners. The door of the sleigh opened with a protest, the hinges stiff and dry, emitting a low, mournful whine that echoed briefly off the stone walls before being swallowed by the snow. The interior was a cavern of shadows. The velvet seats were deep and tufted, colored a dark, dusty crimson that looked brown in the lantern light. The air inside was stale, trapped, holding the faint scent of old lavender and the sharp, metallic tang of the cold that had already seeped through the cracks. The Duchess stepped up, the weight of her skirts dragging against the metal step, and settled herself into the corner of the carriage. The space was small, intimate in a claustrophobic way, a box designed to hold a person still while the world moved around them. She pulled the heavy fur rug over her lap, tucking it in around her legs, creating a seal against the draft that she knew would come. The fur was coarse, heavy, a dead weight that offered comfort only through its mass. She leaned her head back against the squab of the seat. The velvet was cold against her hood. Outside, the door was pushed shut. The latch clicked, a definitive metallic sound that severed her from the courtyard, from the manor, from the life she was leaving behind. There was a pause, a long, suspended moment where nothing happened, where the world seemed to take a breath and hold it. Then, a low whistle from the driver, barely audible through the thick walls of the carriage, and the sensation of motion began. It was not a sudden jerk, but a slow, grinding lurch as the iron runners broke their bond with the ice. The sleigh slid forward, the sound of metal on hard-packed snow rising up through the floorboards, a continuous hissing rasp that would become the heartbeat of the journey. The landscape outside the small, square window began to shift. The stone walls of the courtyard slid away, replaced by the dark, looming shapes of the garden hedges, frozen into geometric blocks of shadow. And then the gates passed by, tall iron fingers grasping at the sky, and they were out. They were into the open, into the vast, breathing wilderness of the north. The sensation of the ride was hypnotic. The sleigh did not roll, it glided, it floated, but with a heaviness that belied the smoothness of the snow. It swayed gently from side to side, a rhythmic cradling motion that was induced by the uneven surface of the winter road. The road itself was invisible, merely a ribbon of slightly smoother snow winding through the trees, illuminated only by the weak cast of the carriage lamps. The light threw moving shadows against the passing trunks, tall, straight pines that stood like sentinels, row upon row, mile upon mile. They were sketched in soft, dark pencils, their needles blurred into masses of deep green and black, their trunks stripes of charcoal against the white ground. Inside the carriage, the Duchess sat in the dark. The only light came from the small glass windows, patches of frosted gray that allowed the moonlight to filter in. The moon was full, a pale, distant coin that offered no warmth, only a cold, scrutinizing illumination. It painted the interior of the sleigh in shades of slate and ash. She watched her own breath materialize before her, a rhythmic puff of white fog that appeared, lingered for a moment as a ghost in the air, and then vanished. In and out, in and out. It was the only clock she had. The passage of time was no longer measured in minutes or hours, but in the number of trees that passed, the number of breaths taken, the slow, numbing creep of the cold through the floorboards. The landscape was monotonous, a repetitive loop of winter. The trees on the left looked exactly like the trees on the right. The snow in front was the same as the snow behind. It was a world of sketches, a drawing that had been made and then copied 1,000 times over to create a corridor of infinite length. The wind began to pick up, a low moaning sound that wrapped around the corners of the sleigh, seeking entry. It buffeted the wooden panels, a soft, insistent pressure that made the carriage creak. The wood complained under the strain, the joinery shifting, the varnish cracking microscopically in the temperature drop. These sounds, the creak, the hiss of the runners, the wind, blended into a drone, a white noise that washed over the mind and smoothed out the edges of thought. She looked at her hands, resting on the fur rug. They were encased in thick leather gloves, the fingers stiff and immobile. They looked like the hands of a doll placed there and forgot. She tried to wiggle her fingers, and the leather resisted, stiff and unyielding. The cold was beginning to penetrate the layers. It was not a sharp pain, but a slow dulling of sensation. It started at the extremities, a heaviness in the toes, a numbness in the fingertips, and worked its way inward. It was a sedative. The cold whispered to the body that it was time to rest, time to stop moving, time to become as still as the trees outside. The Duchess did not fight it. She let the heaviness settle upon her. She felt the weight of her eyelids, heavy as lead curtains, desiring to close, to shut out the endless parade of gray and blue. The road dipped and the sleigh tilted forward, the horses picking up speed as they navigated a gentle slope. The rhythm changed, the hissing of the runners becoming higher in pitch, a sharp singing note that vibrated through the frame of the carriage. The trees flew by faster now, blurring into a solid wall of darkness. The lantern outside swung violently on its hook, the light pitching back and forth, creating a pendulum of shadow that swept across the interior of the carriage. Left, right, left, right. A hypnotic metronome measuring the descent into the valley. The Duchess watched the shadow sweep across her lap, across the velvet seat opposite her. It revealed the texture of the fabric, the worn spots where the pile had been crushed by years of passengers, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light, suspended in the freezing air. At the bottom of the slope, the terrain leveled out and the horses slowed to their plodding, enduring walk. The singing of the runners dropped back to a low rasp. They were entering a forest that was older, denser. The trees here were immense, their branches interlocking overhead to form a vaulted ceiling that blocked out the moon. The darkness deepened. It was a soft, velvety blackness that pressed against the windows, turning them into mirrors. The Duchess could see her own reflection now, a faint, translucent specter floating in the glass. She saw the outline of her hood, the pale oval of her face, the dark hollows of her eyes. She looked like a ghost trapped in a jar. She watched the reflection endure the journey, watched it sway with the movement of the sleigh, untethered and silent. The air inside the carriage grew colder. The warmth she had brought with her from the manor was gone, dissipated into the void. The leather of the seats was hard and unforgiving. She adjusted her position, the layers of wool and velvet rustling with a sound like dry leaves. The sound seemed deafening in the small space. Every movement was amplified, every shift of weight a major event in the stillness. She could feel the vibration of the road in her bones. The runners finding a patch of ice, the slight skid, the correction by the horses, she felt it all without seeing it. She was connected to the sleigh, fused to it by gravity and cold. She was no longer a passenger, she was cargo. She was a piece of the load that the horses dragged through the night. Outside, the snow began to fall again. It started as small, hard pellets that clicked against the glass, a sound like sand being thrown against the window. Then the flakes grew larger, softer. They swirled in the wake of the lantern light, dancing in the turbulence created by the sleigh's passage. They clung to the glass, piling up in the corners of the window frame, building a white border that slowly encroached on her view. The world was being erased bit by bit. The trees were becoming harder to see, veiled behind a curtain of falling white. The indigo night was softening into a uniform gray haze. The visual field was narrowing, focusing the mind inward. There was no sense of distance traveled. There were no milestones, no signposts, no lights from distant cottages to mark the progress. There was only the sensation of time passing, of the earth rotating slowly beneath the runners. The sleigh ride was a loop. It felt as though if she looked out the window long enough, she would see the same tree pass again, the same twisted branch, the same drift of snow. It was a journey to nowhere, a transit through a void that had no geography. The concept of exile ceased to be a political state and became a physical one. She was exiled from warmth, exiled from light, exiled from the linear progression of time. She was existing in a bubble of cold air, suspended between a departure that felt like a dream and an arrival that felt like a myth. The lantern on the side of the sleigh sputtered, the oil feeding the wick unevenly for a moment. The light dimmed, threatening to die, and the shadows inside the carriage leaped forward, consuming the space. Then the flame steadied, and the shadows retreated, skulking back to the corners. The smell of the oil lamp drifted back, faint and acrid, mixing with the smell of the horses and the snow. It was a primitive smell, a scent of fire and survival. It reminded her of the fragility of their situation. A wooden box, a small flame, 2 animals, and a human, all moving through a landscape that was vast, indifferent, and lethally cold. She closed her eyes. The visual world vanished, but the auditory and tactile world intensified. The rasp of the runners became a language, a complex dialogue between steel and ice. She could hear the difference in texture as they passed over fresh snow versus hard-packed ice. Soft, sharp, the rhythm was a lullaby. The swaying of the carriage was the rocking of a cradle. The cold was a heavy blanket, her breathing slowed to match the cadence of the horses. In, out, step, in, out. Step. The solitude was absolute. The coachman never spoke. The horses never whinnied. There was no wildlife to be heard, no owls, no wolves, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. The winter had silenced them all. They were all asleep, burrowed deep under the snow, waiting for a spring that felt impossibly distant. The Duchess was the only thing awake, and even her wakefulness was a trance. Her thoughts were slow, viscous, moving like molasses in the cold. She did not think of the past. The memories of the manor, the faces of those she left, the reasons for her departure, they were all frozen, locked away in a part of her mind that she could not access. She did not think of the future. The destination was a blank white page. There was only the present, the sensation of the wool against her cheek, the numbness in her toes, the sound of the wind. The wind was changing. It was no longer a constant drone, but had developed a pulse. It came in gusts, pushing against the side of the sleigh, rocking it gently. The trees overhead groaned, their frozen fibers stretching. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, a sharp, rifle crack sound that echoed through the forest, startling in its violence before being swallowed instantly by the snow. The horses did not react. They plodded on, heads down, driven by training and instinct. They were machines made of muscle and blood, fueled by the cold air. The Duchess opened her eyes again. The frost on the window had grown thicker. It was now a fern forest of ice crystals, intricate and beautiful, blocking out the view almost entirely. She scraped a small circle with her gloved finger. The ice was hard, stubborn. Through the small peephole, she saw that the forest had opened up. They were crossing a frozen lake or a vast meadow, a flat expanse of white that stretched to the horizon. The wind had free rein here. It swept the snow into low, snaking drifts that migrated across the surface like white dunes. The moonlight was brighter here, unobstructed by the canopy. It turned the snow into a field of blue diamonds. The beauty of it was desolate, alien. It looked like the surface of another planet, a world of silence and ice where life had never taken hold. The sleigh moved faster across the flat terrain. The wind bit harder, finding its way through the microscopic gaps in the door frame. A thin draft of freezing air hit the Duchess's ankle, a needle of cold that pierced the numbness. She adjusted the fur rug again, pulling it tighter, creating a cocoon. She tucked her hands into the opposite sleeves of her cloak, huddling in on herself. She was shrinking, condensing, trying to present the smallest possible surface area to the cold. The carriage felt smaller too, the darkness pressing in. She watched the dust motes again. They were swirling now, agitated by the draft. They looked like tiny stars in a miniature galaxy revolving around the center of the carriage. She focused on one single speck of dust, watching it float, rise on a current of air, and then slowly descend. It was a meditative act. It required no energy, no thought, just observation. The mind emptying itself, the body becoming a stone. The runners hit a patch of rough ice, and the sleigh juddered, a vibration that rattled her teeth. The lantern swung wildly. For a second, the light flared, illuminating the interior with a sudden harsh clarity. The worn leather straps, the brass handle of the door, the intricate pattern of the velvet. Then the light faded back to its sullen gloom. The momentary disruption broke the trance, but only for a heartbeat. The rhythm reasserted itself immediately. Glide, sway, hiss. Glide, sway, hiss. The journey was a state of being. She felt as if she had been in this sleigh for years, as if she had been born in it and would die in it. The manor was a dream. The destination was a dream. The only reality was the wood, the wool, the cold, and the motion. The endless, repetitive motion through the blue and gray dark. She listened to the horses breathing. Even through the walls, she could sense their labor, the heavy huffing of air, the rhythm of their lungs working against the cold. They were the engine of this ride, the only source of heat in the landscape. She imagined the steam rising from their flanks, the ice forming on their whiskers. She felt a strange kinship with them. They were all bound together in this, the driver, the horses, the passenger, a small, moving constellation of life in a universe of dead winter. The road began to wind again, curving around the edge of the open expanse, hugging the tree line. The shadows of the trees reached out like long, dark fingers across the snow, trying to grab the runners to slow them down. The sleigh cut through them, severing the shadows one by one. The play of light and dark was mesmerizing. Flash of white, bar of black, flash of white, bar of black. It created a strobe effect that made her eyes heavy. The heavy lids drooped, the world blurred. The sound of the runners softened, becoming a distant whisper. She was drifting, not into sleep, but into a deeper state of wakeful rest, a hibernation of the mind. The cold was no longer an intruder, it was a blanket, a heavy, numbing comforter that wrapped around her consciousness. The silence of the forest seeped into her thoughts. There were no words left in her head, only images, the blue snow, the black trees, the yellow lantern light, the gray fog of breath. The sleigh continued its journey to nowhere. The runners carved two parallel lines into the surface of the world, a temporary record of their passing that would be erased by the wind within the hour. The night stretched on, eternal and vast. The Duchess sat in the velvet corner, a statue of wool and fur, watching the frost grow on the glass, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, simply existing in the long, cold slide through the dark. The rhythm of the sleigh had become the heartbeat of the world. It was a slow, hypnotic pulse that vibrated through the floorboards, traveled up through the soles of the heavy leather boots, and settled deep into the bones. There was no variation in this pulse, only a steady, grinding continuity that marked the passage of distance without marking the passage of time. The sleigh moved through the dark corridor of the forest like a needle being pulled through thick, resisting velvet. The friction of the iron runners against the packed snow created a sound that was less a noise and more a texture, a rough, granular vibration that filled the small cabin and coated the silence with a layer of auditory grit. Inside the carriage, the air had settled into distinct strata of temperature. Near the floor, where the drafts worked their way through the invisible seams of the joinery, the air was a pool of freezing liquid, heavy and numbing. Higher up, near the roof, where the heat of the Duchess's body rose and trapped itself in the tufted fabric, there was a faint, almost imperceptible ghost of warmth, a memory of a temperature that allowed for life. She sat perfectly still, her body arranged in the corner of the seat like a piece of furniture that had been covered for the winter. The heavy wool of her cloak was stiff, the folds rigid and sculptural, casting deep, angular shadows in the low light of the lantern. The lantern outside continued its solitary vigil against the night. It was the only star in this private universe. Its light washed over the passing trees, revealing the texture of the bark for a fleeting second, the rough, scaled armor of the pines, the smooth, pale skin of the birches, before plunging them back into the anonymity of the dark. The light was weak, a sickly yellow that struggled against the overwhelming blue of the moonlit snow. It did not push the darkness away so much as stain it. tinting the shadows with a sepia tone that made the world look old, preserved in amber and ice. The Duchess watched the interplay of light and shadow on the interior door panel. The wood was dark mahogany, polished once to a high shine, now dulled by the condensation of her breath. A small droplet of water had formed near the top of the window frame. She watched it gather mass, swelling slowly, feeding on the moisture in the air. It was a slow, agonizing process. The droplet grew heavy, trembling with the vibration of the carriage, fighting the surface tension that held it in place. Finally, gravity won. The droplet released its hold and slid down the glass, leaving a jagged, meandering trail through the frost. It moved slowly, hesitating at the bumps in the glass before pooling at the bottom in the rotting rubber seal. The Duchess watched the entire journey of the water. It felt significant. It felt like the only event that had happened in hours. Outside, the character of the forest was changing. The tall, straight pines were giving way to older, more gnarled oaks. Their branches were not neat triangles of green, but twisted skeletal limbs that reached out across the road, interlocking like the fingers of giant, frozen hands. They formed a tunnel, a vaulted ceiling of wood and ice that shut out the sky. The moonlight here was fractured, broken into shards that fell through the gaps in the branches and lay upon the snow like shattered porcelain. The darkness in the tunnel was thicker, heavier. It pressed against the windows of the sleigh, seeking to enter. The wind had died down, or perhaps the density of the trees was blocking it. The silence returned, deeper than before. The only sound was the breathing of the horses, a rhythmic chugging sound like a slow steam engine, and the creaking of the leather harnesses. The leather was old, cured decades ago, and it complained in the cold. It groaned with every step the horses took, a dry, rasping sound that spoke of tension and wear. The Duchess could imagine the strain on the straps, the way the frozen leather bit into the warm coats of the animals. She felt a phantom pressure on her own shoulders, a sympathetic weight. She shifted her legs beneath the fur rug. The movement was small, restricted by the heavy layers of clothing, but it sent a cascade of sensation through her stiff limbs. The pins and needles of returning circulation were sharp, electric, a reminder that she was still biological, still flesh and blood inside the cocoon of wool. The rug was heavy, made from the pelts of bears, coarse and thick. It smelled of musk and cedar, a scent that was grounding. It was a smell of the earth, of things that slept through the winter. She burrowed her hands deeper into the muff she held on her lap. The velvet of the muff was soft, but the silk lining inside was cool to the touch. Her fingers curled around each other, seeking warmth, finding only the smooth, dry skin of her own hands. The carriage jolted slightly as the runners crossed a route hidden beneath the snow. The Duchess's head bumped gently against the padded wall. She did not react. She did not straighten up. She accepted the jolt as part of the ride, a minor turbulence in the stream of time. Her eyes were half closed, her gaze unfocused. The repetitive motion of the passing trees had induced a state of trance. She was no longer looking at the trees. She was looking through them, past them, into the void of the night. The visual information, dark trunk, white snow, dark trunk, white snow, had ceased to be scenery and had become a pattern, a wallpaper that scrolled endlessly past her peripheral vision. The coachman, separated from her by the wooden wall of the carriage, remained a mystery. She could not hear him move. She could not hear him speak to the horses. He was as silent as the snow itself. She wondered idly if he was freezing, if his hands wrapped in their thick mittens were numb on the reins, if his face exposed to the biting air was a mask of frost. But the thought was distant, detached. He was part of the mechanism of the sleigh, a necessary component like the wheels or the shafts. He would endure because he had to endure. That was the nature of their roles. She was the cargo, he was the pilot, and the night was the ocean they were crossing. The road began to rise again. The incline was steep and the horses slowed. Their hooves dug into the snow, searching for purchase. Crunch, slide, grip, crunch, slide, grip. The sound was laborious. The sleigh tilted backward and the Duchess felt gravity pull her deeper into the corner of the seat. She felt the weight of her own head, the heaviness of her eyelids. The ascent seemed to take forever. The trees on the side of the road moved past with agonizing slowness. She could see the individual crystals of snow on the bark, the tiny fissures in the wood, the dried lichens clinging to the north side of the trunks. The world had slowed down to a crawl. At the top of the rise, the trees cleared for a brief moment, revealing a gap in the forest wall. Through the gap, she could see the valley below. It was a vast bowl of darkness, filled with a sea of mist that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The mist was stationary, a frozen lake of cloud that swallowed the bottoms of the trees. It looked cold, deadly, a place where the air was too thick to breathe. Above the mist, the tops of the distant hills floated like islands in a gray ocean. It was a landscape of absolute desolation, beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. There were no lights, no distant farmhouses, no village fires, no sign of human habitation, just the ice, the rock, the trees, and the mist. The sleigh crested the hill and began the descent. The pace quickened. The runners hissed louder, a rising sibilance that sounded like a warning. The carriage swayed more violently now, rocking on its suspension springs. The lantern swung in a wide arc, casting wild, leaping shadows that danced across the interior. The shadows looked like frantic spirits trapped in the box with her, flitting from corner to corner, trying to escape the light. The Duchess watched them without fear. They were just shadows, tricks of the light. Nothing in this frozen world had enough energy to be a ghost. As they descended, the air grew colder. It was a damp cold rising from the mist in the valley floor. It seeped through the floorboards, a physical presence that wrapped around her ankles. She could feel the temperature dropping degree by degree. The moisture in the air began to freeze on the inside of the windows, thickening the frost until the glass was opaque. The view of the outside world was lost, replaced by a canvas of white swirling patterns. The carriage was now truly a sealed capsule. She was cut off from the forest, from the moon, from the road. She was alone in the dark box, moving through a void she could no longer see. She closed her eyes fully now. The darkness behind her eyelids was a relief. It was a warm darkness, unlike the cold blue darkness outside. She listened to the sounds of the sleigh. The creak of the wood was a conversation. The timber frames, stressed by the motion and the cold, were talking to each other. A snap from the roof, a groan from the floor, a high-pitched squeak from the door hinge. It was the language of old materials, of wood that had been a tree 100 years ago, of iron that had been ore in the deep earth. They were complaining, adjusting, settling. The smell of the interior intensified as the ventilation was cut off by the frost. The scent of old leather, of dust, of the lavender sachet sewn into the lining of her cloak, of the faint, smoky residue of the oil lamp. It was a suffocating cocktail of scents, heavy and stale. She breathed it in shallow sips, conserving the warmth in her lungs. The air felt thin, used. She imagined the oxygen being slowly depleted, replaced by the carbon dioxide of her own exhalations. It was a sleepy thought, a thought that led to drowsiness. Her mind drifted. It did not go to specific memories, but to sensations. The feeling of a heavy quilt on a childhood bed, the sound of rain on a slate roof, the taste of cold metal, the weight of a stone in the hand. These fragments of sensation floated through her consciousness like dust motes, unconnected, purposeless. They were distractions from the cold, small anchors to a reality that was not freezing. The sleigh leveled out at the bottom of the hill. They had entered the mist. The sound of the world changed instantly. The crisp, sharp crunch of the snow was muffled, dampened by the moisture in the air. The runners made a soft, slushy sound, a wet hiss. The acoustic space shrank. The echoes of the horses' hooves were swallowed immediately as if the air was made of cotton. The silence here was different. It was not the crisp, empty silence of the high ridge. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. A silence that pressed against the ears. The light from the lantern struggled in the fog. Through the frosted glass, the Duchess could see the glow turn from a sharp yellow to a diffuse, milky luminescence. The light was scattered, reflected back by the millions of water droplets suspended in the air. The window pane glowed with a ghostly, pale aura. It was like being inside a cloud. The sense of motion was lost. Without the visual reference of the passing trees, there was no way to tell if they were moving fast or slow, or if they were moving at all. The swaying of the carriage could have been the wind. The vibration could have been the shivering of the earth. She felt a sudden wave of exhaustion. It was a physical weight that pressed down on her shoulders, pushing her deeper into the seat. It was the weight of the journey, the weight of the cold, the weight of the silence. She wanted to sleep, to let her head fall forward, to let her chin rest on the fur of her collar, to drift away into the gray nothingness. But she held herself upright. It was a matter of discipline. A duchess did not slump. Even in the dark, even in the middle of nowhere, even when no one was watching, the spine had to remain straight. The posture was a fortress. If the posture crumbled, the will would follow. She focused on her toes. They were numb, silent blocks of wood at the end of her feet. She wiggled them inside the boots. The movement was sluggish, distant. She could barely feel the leather touching her skin. The cold had conquered the extremities and was marching inward. She visualized the blood in her veins, thick and slow, struggling to pump warmth to the distant outposts of her body. She imagined a small fire in her chest, a tiny ember of will, glowing red in the center of the blue cold. She fed the fire with her breaths. In, out, feed the ember, keep the core warm. The sleigh made a wide, sweeping turn. The centrifugal force pressed her gently against the side of the carriage. The velvet wall was ice gold against her shoulder. The turn went on for a long time. They were navigating a bend in the river or perhaps circling a large obstacle. The horses labored, their rhythm breaking slightly as they adjusted to the curve. One of them slipped, a heavy thud of a hoof hitting the frame, a scramble of metal shoes on ice. The carriage shuddered violently. The Duchess's hand gripped the fur rug tighter. The driver made a low, soothing sound, a deep, guttural hum that vibrated through the wood. The horse recovered. The rhythm resumed. They were on ice now, river ice. The sound of the runners changed completely. It was a clean, singing tone, a high-pitched ring of metal on hard surface. It was a sharper, more dangerous sound. The ride became smoother, the friction gone. The sleigh glided effortlessly, sliding over the frozen water with a ghostly grace. But the cold was more intense here. The ice radiated a deep, ancient chill that struck up through the floorboards, piercing the wood, piercing the leather, piercing the bone. This was the cold of the deep water, the cold that never saw the sun. The Duchess pulled her cloak tighter, bringing the edges up to her nose. She breathed into the wool, creating a small pocket of warm, moist air. It smelled of wet sheep, a raw, organic smell. It was comforting in its ugliness. It was a smell of life. She kept her face buried in the wool, her eyes fixed on the frosted window. The milky glow of the lantern was fading. The mist was thickening, or the wick was burning low. The light was becoming a dull, brownish smudge. The shadows in the carriage grew longer, merging together, swallowing the definition of the space. The concept of time had dissolved completely. Had it been an hour, a night, a week, the journey felt infinite. The beginning was a faded memory, and the end was an unimaginable concept. There was only this, the glide, the cold, the dark. She was a traveler in a void, a passenger on a ship sailing through a frozen ocean of night. The manor she left behind was a painting she had once seen. The destination she was heading towards was a story she had been told. The reality was the ice. The sound of the wind returned, a low, mournful whistle that cut through the fog. It sounded like a flute played by a giant, a sad, lonely melody that drifted over the ice. The wind buffeted the sleigh, pushing it sideways, making the iron runners skid. The carriage felt fragile, a toy tossed about by the elements. The wood groaned in protest. The Duchess felt a momentary flicker of vulnerability. They were so small, so insignificant in the face of this vast, indifferent winter. A cracked runner, a lame horse, a broken wheel, any of these would mean the end. The cold would simply step in and claim them, covering them with snow, turning them into mounds of white to be discovered in the spring. But the sleigh moved on. It corrected its course. The horses pulled. The driver sat like a stone. The momentum carried them forward. The vulnerability passed, replaced by the dull acceptance of fate. If the runner broke, it broke. If the cold claimed them, it claimed them. Until then, the duty was to sit, to endure, to wait. She watched the frost on the window again. The patterns had changed. The fern-like leaves were gone, replaced by thick, overlapping scales of ice. It looked like the skin of a dragon, impenetrable and hard. She resisted the urge to scrape it away. There was nothing to see outside but the fog. It was better to look at the ice. It was intricate, orderly, perfect. A chaotic world organized into crystalline geometry. The singing of the runners on the ice continued, a long, sustained note that seemed to stretch out into the darkness. It was a sound that belonged to the night. The Duchess closed her eyes again, listening to the song of the ice. It was a lullaby for the exiled, a song for the frozen. She let the sound wash over her, smoothing out her thoughts, slowing her heart, pulling her deeper into the rhythmic trance of the sleigh ride to nowhere. The cold was inside her now, a part of her. She was becoming winter. The singing of the iron runners on the river ice continued, a sustained, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very core of the earth. It was a pure high frequency, a vibration that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the teeth and the skull. On the open snow, the sound had been a rasp, a friction, a negotiation between the vehicle and the ground. Here, on the frozen water, it was a harmony. The sleigh and the ice were in agreement. The resistance was minimal, the friction coefficient reduced to almost nothing, allowing the heavy wooden carriage to slide with a terrifying, ghostly ease. It felt as though the horses were no longer pulling a weight, but simply guiding a vessel that had detached itself from the laws of physics. The fog on the river was denser than the mist in the valley. It was a physical wall of white particulate matter, heavy with moisture that was in the process of freezing. It pressed against the windows of the sleigh, not just obscuring the view, but obliterating the concept of a view. There was no outside anymore. There was only the thick, opaque milkiness that glowed faintly with the reflected light of the carriage lantern. The light itself seemed trapped, unable to penetrate more than a few feet into the soup. It created a small, traveling sphere of illumination, a bubble of pale, sickly yellow that moved through the white void. Inside this bubble, the snowflakes that fell were not crisp stars, but wet, heavy clumps that slapped against the glass and slid down, leaving streaks of water that froze instantly into rime. The Duchess sat in the center of her own silence. The cold of the river was different from the cold of the forest. It was a damp, pervasive chill that did not bite but soaked. It found the microscopic gaps in the weaving of her wool cloak. It found the seams in her leather boots. It seeped into the velvet of the squabs, turning the cushioning into blocks of dense, refrigerated material. She could feel the dampness in her lungs with every breath. The air tasted of wet stone and deep, stagnant water. It was a taste of things that had been submerged for a very long time. It was the taste of the river's sleep. Beneath the runners, beneath the layers of snow and the foot of black ice, the river was still flowing. She thought about that dark, silent current moving endlessly in the dark. The fish suspended in the slow-moving water, their metabolisms dialed down to near zero, floating in the dark like thoughts in a sleeping mind. The weeds, waving gently in the current, green turning to slime black. The mud at the bottom, holding the history of the valley. The sleigh was gliding over a hidden world, separated from it by only a fragile barrier of crystallized water. The thought was not frightening, it was comforting. It reinforced the idea of layers, of worlds stacked upon worlds, all of them cold, all of them silent. A loud crack echoed through the ice, a sonic boom in the miniature world of the river. It sounded like a cannon shot fired deep underground. The noise traveled through the ice sheet, faster than it traveled through the air, and hit the runners with a sharp, percussive thud. The sleigh vibrated, a sudden shiver that rattled the glass in the frames. The horses did not break their stride. They were accustomed to the groans of the river. It was merely the ice settling, the thermal expansion and contraction of the immense sheet as the temperature dropped further. The river was breathing, its chest cracking as it expanded. The sound faded instantly, absorbed by the heavy fog, leaving behind a silence that felt even deeper than before. The Duchess shifted her weight. The movement was slow, deliberate. Her body felt heavy, as if her bones were turning to lead. The lethargy of the cold was a powerful drug. It slowed the neural pathways, widened the gap between the intention to move and the movement itself. She looked at her reflection in the darkened, frosted glass. It was a blur, a smudge of shadow and pale skin. She hardly recognized herself. She was becoming a fixture of the carriage, another texture in the composition of wood, velvet, and leather. She was the dark shape in the corner. She was the observer of the frost. She focused her attention on the interior of the door again. The varnish on the wood was old, crazed with a network of tiny cracks that looked like a map of a dry riverbed. In the dim light, she could trace the patterns. There was a knot in the wood, a dark swirl that looked like an eye. She stared at the wooden eye, and the wooden eye stared back. It was a silent communion. The carriage was full of these details, tiny imperfections, scratches, wear marks that told the story of its long life. The scratch on the brass handle from a ring worn by a passenger 10 years ago. The worn patch on the velvet armrest where 1,000 nervous hands had rubbed the pile away. The sleigh was a vessel of memories, carrying the ghosts of previous journeys along with the current passenger. The ride on the ice seemed endless. Without landmarks, without the rhythm of the trees passing, time lost its structure. It became fluid, pooling, and stretching. Had they been on the river for minutes or hours, the smooth, gliding sensation offered no clues. It was a suspended state, a limbo of white fog and singing metal. The Duchess closed her eyes and listened to the runners. The pitch varied slightly as they passed over different thicknesses of ice. A higher, thinner note for the black ice. A lower, duller note for the snow-covered patches. It was a monotone music, a single string played with infinite patience. Then the texture of the ride changed. The smooth glide was interrupted by a roughness, a drag. The runners bit into something softer, deeper. The singing tone died, replaced by a heavy, churning crunch. The sleigh tilted upward, the front rising significantly. The horses' breathing changed, becoming louder, more labored. The sound of their hooves shifted from the sharp clip-clop on ice to the dull thud on frozen earth. They were leaving the river. They were climbing the bank. The transition was jarring in its lack of grace. The sleigh lurched, the runners catching on roots or rocks hidden beneath the snow. The carriage swayed violently, the springs groaning in protest. The Duchess gripped the strap hanging by the window, the leather stiff and cold in her hand. She felt the gravity pulling her back into the seat. The ascent was steep. The world tilted. She was looking up at the roof of the carriage, the tufted velvet buttons looking like dark stars in a fabric sky. The struggle of the horses was palpable, the strain of the harness, the heave of the chassis. They were dragging the heavy box out of the wet valley, back up into the dry, biting air of the forest. As they crested the riverbank, the fog began to thin. It stripped away in wisps, snagged by the branches of the trees that waited for them. They were entering a new section of the woods, distinct from the regimented pines of the earlier journey. This was an ancient forest, a place of massive, disorderly growth. The trees here were immense, their trunks thick columns of rough bark that disappeared into the darkness above. They stood close together, their roots tangled in the frozen earth, forming a chaotic, impenetrable wall on either side of the narrow road. The darkness returned with a vengeance. The canopy here was so thick that it blotted out the moon completely. The blue ambient light of the snow was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating blackness. The only light was the lantern, and its reach was pitifully short against the absorbing power of the giant trees. The light touched the nearest trunks, revealing moss that hung in frozen stalactites, bark that was deeply furrowed and scarred, and low-hanging branches that clawed at the roof of the sleigh. Scratch, scrape, drag. The branches sounded like fingernails drawn across the wood. It was an intrusive sound, a violation of the carriage's shell. The air in the forest was still, dead still. There was no wind here to moan. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for them to pass. The cold was drier here, sharper. It lacked the damp weight of the river, but it had a biting intensity. It felt older. It felt like the cold of deep space, of places where the sun had never shone. The sleigh settled into a new rhythm. The road was uneven, filled with ruts and frozen mud tracks hidden under the snow. The carriage rocked and pitched, a slow, rolling motion that was nauseatingly consistent. Roll to the left, pause. Roll to the right, pause. The Duchess surrendered to the motion. She allowed her body to go limp, to sway with the carriage. To fight it would be to exhaust herself. To yield was to survive. She became fluid, moving with the wooden box, part of the cargo. She watched the shadows of the branches move across the interior. They were different now, sharper, more complex. They looked like webs, like lace, like shattered glass. They crawled across her lap, up the wall, over the ceiling. They were the only things that moved quickly. Everything else was slow. The horses' plodding steps, the slow creep of the frost on the window, the beating of her own heart, which felt slow and heavy in her chest. Thump, 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 a slow drum in a quiet room. The smell inside the carriage changed again. The wet river smell faded, replaced by the scent of pine resin and decaying wood. It was a sharp, astringent smell. It cleared the head slightly. The Duchess took a deep breath, testing the air. It was cold enough to freeze the hairs in her nose. It tasted of solitude, of a place where humans were not meant to be. She looked at her gloved hands again. They rested on the fur rug, motionless. She tried to remember what it felt like to hold a teacup, to feel the warmth of porcelain, the steam rising against her face. The memory was faint, desaturated. It felt like a memory of a picture, not a memory of an experience. The reality of the heat had been erased by the reality of the cold. The cold was the truth. Heat was a temporary illusion. The road wound deeper into the forest. The trees leaned in, their branches interlocking over the track to form a tunnel. The sleigh moved through this tunnel like a mole burrowing through the earth. The sense of confinement was absolute. There was no sky, no horizon, no distance. Just the immediate illuminated patch of snow in front of the horses and the dark walls of trees on either side. The world had shrunk to a sphere of existence 10 feet in diameter. The Duchess noticed a small detail on the window frame, a small brass latch tarnished and green with age. She focused on the verdigris, the powdery texture of the oxidation. It was a landscape in itself, a green desert on a brass planet. She stared at it until it filled her vision, until it became the most important thing in the universe. This was the sleep formula, the narrowing of focus, the obsession with the trivial, the exclusion of the large and the complex. Don't think about the miles to go. Think about the brass latch, think about the dust mote, think about the scratch on the leather. The sound of the horses' breathing was the only clock. Hi-a-huff, hi-a-huff. It was a comforting biological sound. It reminded her that there was life pulling her, warm, blood-filled life. She imagined the muscles of the horses working under the dark skin, the heat generated by their exertion, the steam billowing from their nostrils, invisible in the dark but present. They were the engines of survival. She felt a vague, distant gratitude towards them. The sleigh hit a patch of deep, powdery snow. The sound of the runners changed to a muffled hush. The ride became softer, floatier. It felt as if they were flying. The friction was gone. The world was soft, white, and silent. The lantern light diffused into the powder, creating a soft, golden glow that wrapped around the carriage. For a moment, it was peaceful, almost warm. The visual was soft pastel, blurred lines, gentle gradients of gray and gold, no hard edges. It was a drawing made with a heavy hand, smudging the colors together. Then the runners found the hard-packed track again. The hiss returned, the vibration returned, the reality returned. The momentary softness was gone, replaced by the grind of the journey. The Duchess blinked, her eyelashes heavy with invisible frost. Her eyes felt dry, gritty. She longed to close them, to keep them closed, to let the darkness inside join the darkness outside. She thought of the manor she had left, the high stone walls, the fireplaces that roared in the great hall. But even those memories were cold. The fire was always too far away. The drafts in the corridors were always icy. The stone was always damp. Perhaps she had never been warm. Perhaps warmth was a lie told by poets. This sleigh ride was not an exile from warmth, but a return to the natural state of things. The cold was the baseline. The universe was cold. The stars were cold. The space between them was cold. She was simply traveling through the truth. The carriage slowed down. The turn was sharp, almost 90 degrees. The horses stumbled, recovered, and pulled hard. The sleigh skidded sideways, the rear end swinging out, carving a wide arc in the snow. The Duchess was pressed into the corner, the velvet pile crushing against her cheek. She stayed there for a moment, even after the sleigh straightened out. It was a comfortable position. It required less effort to hold her head up. She looked at the buttons on the seat back, inches from her eyes. They were covered in the same velvet, gathered in the center. They looked like small, dark flowers. She pushed herself back up, slowly, vertebrae by vertebrae. The effort was immense. Her muscles felt like stiff rubber bands. She adjusted the cloak, smoothing the folds. The order must be maintained. The silhouette must remain composed. She was the Duchess. This was her carriage. This was her road. Even if the road went nowhere, she would ride it with dignity. The forest seemed to be thinning slightly, or perhaps the trees were just receding from the road. The tunnel effect lessened. The darkness lifted a fraction, allowing a deep indigo twilight to filter in. It wasn't light exactly, but it was less dark than before. She could see the shapes of the trees again, their silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. They looked like torn paper cutouts, ragged and black. The wind began to pick up again. It was a high, thin wind that whistled through the upper branches. It didn't shake the carriage, but it made the trees sing. A low, mournful moaning sound that rose and fell. It sounded like a choir of ghosts singing a dirge for the winter. The Duchess listened to the song. It was sad, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to her presence. She was just a speck passing through the cathedral of the woods. The cold was seeping through the floorboards with renewed intensity. Her feet were no longer part of her body. They were foreign objects inside her boots. She tried to curl her toes, but the signal from her brain seemed to get lost on the way down. There was no sensation, just a dull, heavy absence. She accepted this too. The numbness was a mercy. It took away the discomfort. It replaced the pain with a void. She looked at the window. The frost had completely covered the glass now. It was a thick white curtain. There was no more looking out. The world was gone. She was sealed in. The carriage was a capsule floating in a white void. There was only the interior, the velvet, the wood, the leather, the cold, and the sound. The endless, rhythmic, hypnotic sound of the runners on the snow. Hiss, grind, hiss, grind. It was the heartbeat of the sleep. It was the rhythm of the exile. The lantern flickered, casting a brief, trembling shadow that stretched across the floor like a dark hand reaching for her. Then it steadied. The hand retracted. The Duchess watched it go. She did not move. She did not blink. She simply sat, a figure drawn in charcoal and dark pastel, waiting for the next breath, the next mile, the next beat of the runner against the ice. The journey continued, a slide through the dark that had no beginning and no end. The transition from the forest to the open country was not marked by a gate or a signpost, but by a sudden, overwhelming expansion of the acoustic space. The claustrophobic echo of the trees, which had bounced the sound of the hooves back into the carriage, vanished instantly. It was replaced by a vast, hollow silence that stretched out to the horizon in every direction. The sleigh had emerged onto the high moors, a desolate plateau of rolling snow-covered hills, where the wind had scoured the land clean of vegetation. Here, the world was no longer a corridor of vertical trunks. It was a horizontal infinity, a sheet of white paper stretching out under a dome of indigo-black sky. The wind met them immediately. It did not strike with violence, but with a steady, heavy pressure, leaning against the side of the sleigh like a giant, invisible shoulder. It was a constant force, a river of air flowing across the plateau without obstruction. Inside the carriage, the sound was a low, resonant thrumming, the vibration of the air moving over the wooden panels. It was the sound of a bow being drawn across a cello string in slow motion, deep, mournful, and unending. The carriage rocked gently in the slipstream, a rhythmic swaying that felt like the motion of a boat on a calm, deep ocean. The Duchess felt the change in the air pressure. The cabin felt tighter, sealed against the vacuum of the night. The drafts that snaked through the floorboards were sharper now, driven by the force of the wind. They carried the scent of pure ice, a smell that was clean to the point of sterility. It smelled of nothing, of the absence of life, of the space between stars. She pulled the bear fur rug higher, tucking it under her chin. The fur was coarse against her skin, tickling slightly, but the warmth it trapped was the only currency that mattered. She hoarded it, breathing shallowly to keep the heat close to her body. The light from the lantern was swallowed by the vastness of the moor. There were no trees to catch the beam, no branches to reflect the yellow glow. The light simply spilled out onto the snow and died a few feet away, unable to penetrate the immense darkness. The snow here was different. It was not the soft, powdery accumulation of the forest floor. It was hard, wind-packed, sculpted into sharp ridges and waves that looked like a frozen sea. The runners of the sleigh rode over these ridges with a complex, stuttering rhythm. Hiss-bum-piss, hiss-bum-piss. It was a texture that vibrated through the entire frame of the vehicle, a constant reminder of the hardness of the world outside. The moon had risen higher, escaping the veil of the clouds. It hung in the sky like a perfect circle of white ice, cold and distant. Its light washed over the plateau, turning the snow into a landscape of blue and silver. The shadows of the drifts were long and sharp, drawn with hard charcoal lines against the pastel blue of the snow. The visual style of the night had shifted from the soft, smudged darkness of the woods to a high-contrast etching. Every ridge, every dip in the snow was defined by the harsh, clarifying light of the moon. It was a beautiful, uninhabitable landscape, a place where beauty and death were the same thing. The Duchess stared at the window, but the frost was now a permanent fixture, a thick, opaque layer of ice on the inside of the glass. It blocked the view of the moors, leaving her to imagine the emptiness outside. The frost had grown into a landscape of its own, a miniature range of crystal mountains, valleys of clear ice, forests of fern-like fractals. She studied the geology of the window pane. Near the corner, the ice was thickest, a white opacity that looked like quartz. Near the center, it was thinner, a translucent gray that hinted at the moonlight beyond. She watched the way the lantern light caught the edges of the crystals, making them sparkle with a dull, amber fire. It was a private galaxy, frozen in glass. She felt a profound sense of isolation. On the river, there had been the sense of the water beneath. In the forest, there had been the presence of the trees. Here on the moor, there was nothing. The sleigh was a speck of matter moving through a void. The horses were the only other living things for miles. She listened to their hooves, a dull, rhythmic thudding on the hard-packed snow. They were tired. She could hear it in the tempo, which had slowed to a dogged, mechanical plod. They were not moving with spirit, they were moving with inertia. They were leaning into the harness, letting their weight carry them forward, step by agonizing step. The cold inside the carriage had deepened. It was no longer an intruder, it was the resident atmosphere. The leather of the seat had become as hard as wood. The velvet had lost its softness, the fibers stiffened by the frost. The Duchess's breath did not just mist, it clouded, thick and heavy, hanging in the air for long seconds before settling as rime on the fabric of the hood. She was breathing ice and exhaling fog. Her body was a furnace banking its fires, concentrating all its heat in the core, sacrificing the extremities to the night. Her feet were gone, lost in the boots. Her hands were distant shapes in the muff. She was a consciousness centered in the chest and the head, observing the slow freezing of the vessel. The road across the moor was straight. There were no turns to navigate, no obstacles to avoid. It was a line drawn across the blank page of the snow. The lack of maneuvering made the ride hypnotic. There was no need to brace for a corner, no change in the gravitational pull, just the forward motion, endless and linear. The mind, deprived of new stimuli, began to fold in on itself. Thoughts became loops, repeating the same fragments of memory, the same observations, the texture of the wool. The sound of the wind, the color of the shadow, the texture of the wool, the sound of the wind. She found herself staring at a single brass screw head on the window latch. The slot of the screw was filled with a tiny plug of grime, ancient dust solidified by oil and time. She wondered about the person who had driven that screw. A worker in a carriage shop decades ago in a warm workshop that smelled of sawdust and glue. He had turned the screwdriver, tightened the brass, and wiped it with a rag. He was dead now, surely, gone to dust, but the screw remained. The work remained, traveling through the frozen night, holding the window against the wind. It was a melancholy thought, but not a sad one. It was simply a fact. Things outlasted people. The sleigh would outlast the horses. The winter would outlast them all. The wind outside shifted, changing pitch. It rose from a low drone to a high, thin whistle that pierced the cabin. It found a gap in the door seal, a microscopic failure in the weather stripping. A thin jet of freezing air shot into the carriage, hitting the Duchess on the cheek like an invisible needle. She flinched, turning her face away, pulling the hood of her cloak further forward. The draft was relentless. It was the wilderness finding a way in. She shifted her position, pressing her shoulder against the padded wall to block the airflow. She became a part of the insulation, using her own body to seal the breach. The landscape outside, though invisible to her, was changing subtly. The flat plateau was giving way to a series of gentle, rolling ridges. The sleigh began to rise and fall, a slow oceanic motion. Up the long slope, the runners hissing with increased friction, the horses grunting with the effort. Then the crest, a moment of weightlessness, and the long, sliding descent, the sleigh picking up speed, the wind whistling louder, the shadows stretching out. It was a rhythm of exertion and release, exertion and release. The Duchess closed her eyes and let the motion rock her. It was a cradle of ice. She drifted into a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness. It was a gray twilight of the mind. In this state, the sounds of the journey became amplified and distorted. The creak of the wood sounded like a voice muttering in a foreign language. The hiss of the runners sounded like a choir holding a single, breathless note. The thud of the hooves sounded like the beating of a giant heart buried deep in the earth. She was no longer separate from the sleigh. She was woven into its fabric. She was the velvet. She was the wood. She was the frost. A sudden, deeper jolt shook the carriage as the runners crossed a patch of rough ice. The lantern swung violently, the shadows lurching across the cabin. The sudden movement pulled her back from the edge of the trance. She opened her eyes. The interior was the same. The cold was the same. The night was the same. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt older. The dust on the floor seemed to have settled more deeply. The frost on the window seemed thicker. The journey was aging her, eroding the sense of time until a minute felt like a year. She looked at her reflection again. It was just a silhouette, a dark shape against the gray glass. She could not see her eyes, only the hollows where they should be. She raised a hand to touch her face. The leather glove was cold against her skin, lifeless and stiff. She traced the line of her jaw, the bridge of her nose, confirming the geometry of her own existence. She was still there, warm flesh beneath the cold leather, a living passenger in a dead world. The sleigh began a long, steady climb. The angle of the floor tilted back. The horses slowed to a crawl. The wind howled louder, resisting their ascent. They were climbing toward the highest point of the moor, the roof of the desolate world. The air grew thinner, sharper. The cold became more aggressive, biting through the layers of wool and fur. The Duchess shivered, a violent, involuntary spasm that ran through her entire body. It was the body's protest, a desperate attempt to generate heat. She clenched her muscles, fighting the shiver, forcing stillness back into her limbs. Shivering consumed energy. Energy was life. She had to conserve it. She focused on the sound of the chains on the harness. Clink drag, clink drag. It was a metallic, rhythmic sound, sharp and distinct against the muffled roar of the wind. It sounded like the ticking of a clock made of ice and iron. It measured the steps, 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Every step was a victory against gravity and the snow. Every step was a defiance of the static nature of the winter. The darkness inside the carriage seemed to have weight. It pressed against her eyelids, pressed against her chest. It was a heavy, fluid darkness like ink. She felt as if she were submerged in it. The lantern light was a tiny island of yellow in a black sea. She watched the flame through the side of the glass lamp if she craned her neck. It was small, unwavering, a miracle of chemistry, all becoming light, matter becoming energy. It was the only warm thing in the universe. She loved that flame. She directed her thoughts towards it, imagining she could draw warmth from it by sheer force of will. Outside, the snow was drifting. The wind picked up the loose crystals and drove them in low, serpentine clouds across the hardpack. They flowed like water, streaming over the runners, piling up against the leeward side of the sleigh. The sound was a soft, dry sibilance like sand pouring over paper. The snow was burying them as they moved. If they stopped even for an hour, the drift would consume the sleigh. It would become just another mound on the moor, a white bump in a field of white bumps. The thought emphasized the necessity of motion. To stop was to die, to move was to live. The incline leveled off. They had reached the summit of the ridge. The wind here was fierce, unobstructed for 1,000 miles. It shook the heavy carriage, rattling the door in its frame. The lantern swung wildly, threatening to extinguish. The Duchess held her breath. If the light went out, the darkness would be absolute. The cold would feel twice as deep, but the flame held. It danced, it dipped, but it held. The horses picked up the pace, eager to get off the exposed ridge. The sleigh dipped forward, beginning the descent into the next trough of the land. The descent was smooth, a long glide into the shadows of the valley below. The wind noise dropped, cut off by the rising slope of the hill behind them. The silence returned, rushing back in to fill the void. The relief was physical. The tension in the carriage frame released. The wood settled. The Duchess exhaled a long plume of white fog. They had crossed the high point. They were descending again, back towards the shelter of the lower lands, or perhaps just into a deeper, colder hollow. She watched the shadow of the coachman on the snow, visible through a small clear patch in the corner of the window. He was a blocky, immobile shape, rocking slightly with the motion of the sleigh. He looked like a boulder that had been placed on the driver's seat. He never looked back. He never checked on her. He knew his duty and she knew hers. They were separate entities, bound by the destination. She wondered if he was asleep. If the horses knew the way well enough to guide a sleeping man, it didn't matter. As long as the runners hissed, as long as the world moved past, it didn't matter who was awake. The terrain at the bottom of the descent was uneven. The sleigh bumped and jostled, the suspension springs creaking loudly. The smooth, hypnotic rhythm was broken, replaced by a chaotic, jarring motion. The Duchess was tossed gently from side to side. Her shoulder hit the wall, her head nodded forward. It was uncomfortable, but it was sensation. It broke the numbness. She welcomed the discomfort. It was a reminder that she could still feel. The snow here was deep again. The runners cut trenches into the surface, sinking down, making the ride heavy and sluggish. The sound was a muffled crunching. The air felt heavier, thicker. The smell of the high ozone was gone, replaced by the scent of stagnant, cold air that had been sitting in this hollow for weeks. It was the air of a tomb, still, silent, and preserved. She looked at the ceiling of the carriage. The tufted velvet was dark, almost black in the shadows. The buttons were arranged in a diamond pattern. She began to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. She lost count. She started again. 1, 2, 3. The mind needed a task, a rail to run on, counting buttons, tracing cracks, listening to the hiss. This was the work of the journey. The sleigh slowed to a crawl as it navigated a deep drift. The horses lunged, their hooves scrambling for purchase. The carriage shuddered, threatened to stop. The Duchess felt a spike of adrenaline, a cold, sharp fear in her gut. If they stuck here in this hollow, it would be the end. She gripped the fur rug, her knuckles white inside the gloves. "Move," she whispered. The word was swallowed by the wool of her scarf. "Move." The horses heaved, the wood groaned. The sleigh lurched forward, broke free of the drift, and slid onto firmer snow. The rhythm resumed. The fear subsided, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion. She leaned back, the adrenaline fading, leaving her colder than before. The journey continued. The moor was endless, a sea of frozen waves that went on forever. The sleigh was a tiny dark boat sailing on a white ocean. The night was a heavy curtain that would never lift. The Duchess sat in the dark, a queen of nothing, ruling over a kingdom of ice and silence. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm take her. Hiss, bump, the song of the runners, the heartbeat of the exile, the sleep of the snow. The hollow gave way not to another open plain, but to a narrowing of the land, a funnel of geography that guided the sleigh toward a jagged scar in the earth. They were entering a gorge, a deep incision cut into the bedrock of the moorlands by a river that had dried up 1,000 years ago. The walls of the gorge rose up on either side, steep and sheer, blocking out the expansive indigo sky and replacing it with cliffs of raw, frozen stone. The rock was dark, striped with veins of quartz and ice, looking like the fossilized muscle of the earth itself. The moonlight, which had washed the moors in silver, could not reach the bottom of this chasm. Here, the world was composed entirely of shadows, deep blues, and absolute blacks. The soundscape shifted instantly as the sleigh passed between the first towering pillars of rock. The wind, which had been a constant, buffeting presence on the high ground, was cut off, severed by the canyon walls. The silence that fell was sudden and profound. It was a silence so deep it felt pressurized, like the silence at the bottom of an ocean. In this vacuum, the sounds of the journey were amplified to a startling degree. The scrape of the runners against the stone-hard snow echoed off the cliff faces, bouncing back and forth until it sounded like a dozen sleighs were traveling in a ghostly convoy. The breathing of the horses became a rhythmic roaring, the huff and puff of their lungs reverberating in the narrow space like the bellows of a giant forge. The Duchess felt the change in the air pressure in her ears, a subtle popping sensation that marked the descent into the deep earth. The air here was still, stagnant, and incredibly cold. It was a cold that had pooled in the bottom of the gorge for centuries, undisturbed by the sun or the wind. It was heavy, dense, sinking through the floorboards of the carriage and wrapping around her legs like icy water. She pulled her feet back, tucking them under the hem of her heavy woolen skirt, but there was no escape. The cold was the environment now. It was the medium through which they moved. The lantern light, which had been lost in the vastness of the moor, suddenly found surfaces to cling to. It washed over the passing rock walls, illuminating the texture of the stone in sharp relief. The Duchess watched the geology slide past her window. Rough granite, slick basalt, shelves of slate layered like the pages of a stone book. The light revealed the frozen waterfalls that hung from the cliffs, massive curtains of icicles that looked like the pipes of a cathedral organ, silent and white. They were beautiful and menacing, suspended tons of ice that seemed to be waiting for a signal to fall. The lantern caught the facets of the icicles, making them spark with brief, diamond-like glints before they vanished back into the dark. The road through the gorge was narrow and treacherous. It followed the winding path of the ancient riverbed, twisting around fallen boulders and navigating sharp bends. The sleigh moved slowly here. The horses picked their way with caution, their hooves searching for purchase on the uneven ground. The smooth, hypnotic glide of the open snow was replaced by a lurching staccato rhythm. Lurch, stop, slide, scrape. The carriage rocked violently from side to side, tossing the Duchess against the padded walls. The velvet was no longer a comfort, it was a buffer against bruising. She braced herself with one hand against the seat, the leather of her glove gripping the fabric. She looked at the interior of the carriage, seeking a focal point to steady her mind against the chaotic motion. Her eyes settled on the leather strap that hung by the window, a loop meant for a standing passenger to hold. It swung back and forth like a pendulum, marking the sway of the vehicle. Left, right, left, right. The leather was old, cracked, revealing the lighter, fibrous interior beneath the dark dye. It looked like dry skin. She watched it swing, mesmerizing herself with the simple physics of the movement. It was a metronome counting down the seconds of a journey that had no duration. The gorge was a place of shadows. The high walls blocked the moon, but the light that filtered down from the strip of sky above was a strange, diffused violet. It mixed with the yellow lantern light to create a sickly, bruised color palette. The snow on the ground was not white, but a dirty gray, stained by the dust of the crumbling rocks. It looked like ash. The entire landscape felt dead, an acropolis of stone and ice. The Duchess felt a heaviness in her chest, a sense of oppression. The walls were closing in. The world was narrowing down to a single frozen track. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the looming rocks. In the darkness of her mind, she tried to conjure a memory of heat. A summer day in the garden, the smell of roses, the hum of bees, the feel of the sun on her face. But the memory was faint, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The colors had run, the details had blurred. She could not feel the heat. She could only remember the idea of heat. The reality of the cold was too strong. It overwrote everything else. The sensation of the freezing air in her nostrils was the only truth. The numb weight of her feet was the only reality. The sleigh hit a particularly rough patch, the runners grinding over gravel mixed with the snow. The sound was harsh, a scream of metal on stone. It set her teeth on edge. The carriage shuddered, a vibration that rattled her bones. Then they were past it, back onto smoother snow. The silence returned, deeper than before. The echo of the scrape lingered for a moment in the canyon, fading slowly like a dying note. She wondered about the coachman. How did he navigate this darkness? How did he see the turn of the track, the hidden boulder, the patch of black ice? He must be part owl, part machine. He sat out there in the open, exposed to the stagnant cold, guiding them with silent, invisible cues. She felt a strange, distant respect for him. He was the ferryman carrying her across the river Styx. But this Styx was frozen, and the ferry was a wooden box on iron runners. The gorge began to widen slightly. The walls receded, stepping back to form terraced cliffs. On these terraces, stunted trees clung to life. They were twisted, gnarled shapes, their branches growing horizontally, shaped by the wind that must funnel through here during storms. They looked like tortured souls frozen in wood. The lantern light caught their skeletal limbs, casting long, spider-like shadows that crawled across the snow and up the side of the sleigh. The shadows flickered and danced, creating the illusion of movement in a static world. The Duchess watched the shadows. They were her companions. They sat with her in the carriage, fleeting and silent. She held out her hand, letting a shadow pass over her glove. It was a game of light and dark, a way to pass the time. Time that was not passing but accumulating, piling up like the snow drifts. The air in the carriage was growing stale. The ventilation was poor, the windows sealed by frost. She felt a dull ache in her temples, the beginning of a headache brought on by the thin air and the cold. She breathed slowly, deliberately. In, out, conserving oxygen, conserving heat. She was a system in low-power mode, a machine running on reserves. Suddenly, the horses stopped. The motion ceased. The silence was absolute. The cessation of the rhythm was jarring, more disturbing than the roughest movement. The Duchess opened her eyes fully. Why had they stopped? Was there a blockage? Had a horse fallen? She sat perfectly still, listening. She heard the heavy breathing of the animals, loud in the canyon acoustics. She heard the creak of the wood as the carriage settled. But there were no voices, no shout from the driver, just the stillness. She waited. Seconds turned into minutes. The cold began to creep in with renewed vigor, no longer held at bay by the friction of movement. It pressed against the windows, against the doors. The temperature inside the cabin dropped perceptibly. She pulled the fur rug up to her nose. She could see her breath puffing out in quick, nervous clouds. Why were they not moving? She reached out and scratched a small hole in the frost on the window. The ice was thick, hard as glass. It took effort. Her fingernails scraped against the pane, a tiny, irritating sound. Finally, she cleared a space the size of a coin. She put her eye to the hole. Outside, the world was a study in gray and black. The lantern light illuminated a massive drift of snow that had slid down from the cliff, blocking the path. It was a wall of white debris. The horses were standing before it, heads down, waiting. The coachman was climbing down from his seat. She saw his dark shape move past the window, a silhouette against the snow. He moved slowly, stiffly. He disappeared into the gloom ahead. She was alone in the box. The sense of vulnerability was acute. If they could not pass, what then? To turn around in this narrow gorge was impossible. To back up was impossible. They were trapped, entombed in the stone. She felt a flicker of panic, a cold flame in her gut, but she tamped it down. Panic was a waste of energy. Panic was warm, and she needed to be cold. She needed to be like the stone, patient, enduring. She heard the sound of a shovel. Scrape, toss, scrape, toss. The rhythm was slow, methodical. The coachman was digging a path. It was a solitary Sisyphean task, one man against a mountain of snow. She listened to the sound. It was the only sound in the world. It was the sound of survival. Every scrape was a promise that they would move again. Every toss of the snow was a defiance of the winter. She leaned her head back against the seat and listened. Scrape, toss, toss. It became a lullaby. The rhythm meshed with her heartbeat. She drifted. The boundaries of the carriage seemed to dissolve. She was out there in the snow, feeling the weight of the shovel, the bite of the cold. She was the snow being moved. She was the rock watching. She was the darkness. Time lost all meaning during the stop. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. The cold seeped into her bones. Her feet were blocks of ice. Her hands were numb claws. She huddled deeper into the furs, trying to retreat into the center of her body. She was a small spark of consciousness wrapped in layers of dead animal skins, waiting for the motion to return. And then the sound of the shovel stopped. There was a pause, then the crunch of boots on snow. The dark shape passed the window again. The carriage dipped as the coachman climbed back onto the box. The springs groaned. The silence held for a moment longer. Then the whistle, low, sharp. The leather reins snapped. The sleigh lurched forward. The runners hissed. They were moving. The relief was not a rush of emotion, but a simple physical release of tension. The muscles in her back relaxed. The breath left her lungs in a long, slow sigh. The rhythm returned. Hiss, scrape, hiss, scrape. They were passing the drift. The carriage tilted to the side, riding up on the bank of the cleared snow, then slammed back down onto the track. They were through. The journey continued. The gorge seemed to go on forever, bend after bend, cliff after cliff, but the motion was back. The hypnosis resumed. The Duchess closed her eyes again. The interlude of the stop faded into memory, becoming just another texture in the long, gray tapestry of the night. The incline began to change. The nose of the sleigh tilted downward. The horses moved with less effort. They were descending. The gorge was spitting them out, sending them down into whatever lay below. The speed increased. The echoes of the runners on the walls became a continuous, high-pitched ringing. The wind began to return, a low moan at first, then a whistle as the canyon widened and allowed the air to flow again. The transition out of the gorge was gradual. The walls lowered, becoming hills, then mounds, then flat ground. The sky opened up, revealing the vast dome of stars again. The moon was lower now, casting long, stretching shadows across the snow. They had entered a forest of dead trees. It was a swamp in the summer, but now it was a frozen wasteland of stumps and broken trunks. The trees were silver gray, stripped of bark, standing in frozen black pools of ice. They looked like the pillars of a ruined temple. The sleigh glided among them. The ground here was flat, the snow smooth. The ride became fluid again. The silence was different here, not the pressurized silence of the gorge, but the open, desolate silence of a graveyard. The only sound was the hiss of the runners and the wind rattling the dry branches of the dead trees. Click, clack, click. It sounded like bones hitting together. The Duchess watched the dead forest pass. It was beautiful in a stark, horrific way. The moonlight turned the ice pools into mirrors, reflecting the twisted shapes of the trees. The world was doubled, a forest above, a forest below. The sleigh moved between them, suspended on the surface of the ice. She felt weightless, floating through a dreamscape of silver and black. The cold was constant. It was the one thing that never changed. It was the anchor, the baseline, the absolute. The Duchess accepted it. She welcomed it. She was no longer fighting it. She was letting it in. She was becoming transparent to the cold. It passed through her, meeting no resistance. She was the ice. She was the snow. She was the ride. The rhythm of the runners settled into a steady, droning hum. It was the sound of eternity, the sound of a journey that would never end. The Duchess sat in the velvet dark, a statue of patience, watching the dead trees slide by, waiting for the next mile, the next hour, the next layer of the night to unfold. The dead forest was a landscape of silver and charcoal, a monochromatic study in vertical lines and frozen water. The sleigh moved through it with a ghostly quietness, the runners gliding over the flat, frozen expanse of the swamp that lay beneath the trees. Here, the ground was not solid earth but a labyrinth of black pools locked in ice, separated by narrow ridges of peat and frozen mud. The snow had dusted the ridges white, creating a stark, high-contrast pattern that looked like the skeletal ribcage of the earth exposed to the moonlight. The trees themselves were stripped of all life, their bark long since peeled away by the seasons of wet and cold, leaving the wood smooth, gray, and bone-like. They stood in the ice like silent sentinels, their roots submerged in the frozen mire, their branches reaching up into the indigo darkness like the cracked fingers of 1,000 submerged statues. The air in the swamp was different from the gorge. It was heavy with the scent of ancient, arrested decay. It smelled of wet peat, of rotting vegetation that had been frozen mid-decomposition, and of the metallic tang of standing water. It was a cold that felt dense, a physical weight that pressed against the chest and the eardrums. The mist here was low-lying, hugging the surface of the ice in thin, wispy ribbons that curled around the trunks of the dead trees. The sleigh cut through these ribbons, swirling them into vortices that lingered for a moment in the wake of the runners before settling back into stillness. The Duchess watched the passing scenery through the small, cleared circle in the frost of her window. The lantern light played tricks in this environment. It reflected off the black ice, creating double images of the trees, one standing, one inverted in the dark mirror below. The world seemed to have no bottom. The sleigh felt as though it were floating on a thin crust of crystal over a deep, watery void. She could see bubbles trapped in the ice, suspended in time, white spheres of air that had been caught on their way to the surface when the freeze set in. They looked like pearls scattered on black velvet. The sound of the journey had changed again. The sharp hiss of the open moor and the ringing echo of the gorge were gone. Here the sound was a dull, hollow rumble. The ice over the swamp was thick, but it sat on water and mud, creating a drum-like resonance. Every hoofbeat produced a low, thudding bass note that vibrated through the floorboards of the carriage. Thud, 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 thud. It was a sound that felt subterranean, a pulse coming from deep below the surface. The runners made a lower, grinding sound, a friction that spoke of the grit and debris embedded in the ice. The carriage swayed gently, a rhythmic side-to-side motion that was induced by the uneven nature of the frozen tussocks. The Duchess let her head rest against the velvet squab. The fabric was cold and stiff, the pile flattened by the weight of her skull. She felt the vibration of the ground in her teeth. It was a constant, low-frequency hum that numbed the jaw and the neck. She was becoming attuned to the frequencies of the winter. She could distinguish the sound of the runner hitting a root from the sound of it hitting a patch of pure ice. She was a connoisseur of cold sounds. The trees grew closer together as the track wound deeper into the swamp. The branches overhead interlocked, forming a lattice of gray wood that filtered the moonlight into shattered patterns on the ground. The wind rattled these dry branches, a sound like wooden wind chimes clicking together. Click-clack, click-clack. It was a dry, skeletal sound, the only conversation in the forest. There were no birds, no owls, no foxes. The swamp was empty of blood and breath, save for the horses and the passengers of the sleigh. It was a place where life had given up, surrendering to the permanence of the frost. The Duchess looked at her hands, resting on the fur rug. The leather gloves were motionless, dark shapes against the brown fur. She tried to remember the sensation of touch, the feel of silk, of warm water, of a page of a book. The memories were abstract, intellectual concepts rather than sensory recollections. The nerves in her fingertips were asleep, hibernating until the spring that might never come. She felt a strange dissociation from her body. Her hands belonged to the carriage. Her feet belonged to the boots. She was merely the mind floating in the dark box, observing the existence of these objects. The sleigh approached a structure that loomed out of the mist, a bridge. It was a low, wooden causeway built to span a particularly wide and treacherous section of the mire. The timber was old, black with moisture and age, and covered in a thick layer of green moss that had frozen into a hard, slippery carapace. The rails were crooked, leaning out over the black ice below at precarious angles. It looked less like a bridge and more like a shipwreck that had been repurposed. The horses slowed as they stepped onto the wooden planks. The sound changed instantly. The dull thud of the swamp gave way to a sharp, hollow clomp-clomp that echoed loudly in the stillness. The wood groaned under the weight of the heavy animals. It was a sound of protest, a deep structural creaking that seemed to come from the very grain of the timber. Creak, clomp, creak, clomp. The rhythm was slow, cautious. The driver was taking no chances. The sleigh slid onto the bridge. The runners transitioned from ice to wood with a harsh scrape. The carriage vibrated violently for a moment, then settled into a rough, rolling motion over the uneven planks. The Duchess gripped the armrest. She could hear the water beneath the bridge, or perhaps the shifting of the mud, a wet, sucking sound that was barely audible over the hoofbeats. She looked out the window and saw the edge of the bridge passing by, inches from the wheel. Beyond the edge was darkness, a drop into the frozen unknown. The lantern light illuminated the texture of the bridge beams. They were deeply furrowed, the grain raised by decades of weathering. She saw the head of an iron spike, rusted to deep orange, protruding from a post. It was a small detail, a splash of warm color in a world of blue and gray. She focused on the rust. It was a sign of oxidation, of slow burning. Even here in the cold, things were burning away atom by atom. The bridge was dying, rotting slowly in the freeze. It was a comforting thought. Everything was transient. Everything was on its way to becoming dust or mud. The crossing seemed to take hours. The bridge was not long, perhaps only 50 yards, but the slowness of the pace stretched the time. The Duchess counted the planks as they passed under the window. 1, 2, 3, dark stripe, light stripe, dark stripe, light stripe. The repetition was soothing. It occupied the mind, preventing it from wandering to thoughts of the cold or the distance remaining. There was only the plank, and the next plank, and the next. Finally, the horses stepped off the timber and back onto the frozen earth. The hollow clomp ceased, replaced by the familiar dull thud. The sleigh slid down a small embankment, the runners hissing as they found the ice again. The tension in the carriage frame released. The groaning of the wood stopped. They were back on the solid, silent swamp. The bridge receded into the mist behind them, a dark scar on the silver landscape, waiting for the next traveler who might not come for another 100 years. The track widened slightly, leading them past the ruins of what might have once been a settlement. It was barely recognizable now, just a few mounds of stone covered in snow, the suggestion of a wall, the stump of a chimney. It was a village that had been swallowed by the swamp in the winter. The Duchess watched the shapes slide past. They were soft, rounded by the snow, looking like sleeping animals. There was no sadness in the sight, only a quiet melancholy. People had lived here once. They had built fires, cooked food, slept in beds. Now they were gone, and the land had reclaimed the space. She imagined the lives of those people. Short, hard lives spent fighting the damp and the cold. They were the ancestors of this journey. They had known the weight of the winter. They had known the silence. She felt a kinship with them, these ghosts of the swamp. She was joining them in a way, passing through their territory, sharing their cold. The sleigh was a moving ruin, a temporary structure passing through the permanent ruins. The snow began to fall again. It was different this time, not the heavy flakes of the forest, nor the driving pellets of the moor. This was a fine, crystalline dust, diamond dust snow that sparkled in the air like glitter. It fell straight down, undisturbed by wind. It coated the window in a fine, powdery layer that softened the view even further. The vintage pastel drawing of the world was being smudged, the lines blurring, the contrast fading. The black trees became gray ghosts. The white ridges became soft clouds. The world was dissolving into a fog of particulate matter. The Duchess watched the dust accumulate on the ledge of the window frame outside. It built up in millimeters, a slow, inexorable rising of the white tide. She wondered how long it would take for the snow to bury the sleigh completely if they stopped. A day, 2 days, the thought was abstract. The snow was patient. It had all the time in the world. Inside the carriage, the temperature seemed to have stabilized at a point just above absolute freezing. The Duchess's breath was a constant companion, a rhythmic cloud that obscured her vision for a second with every exhalation. She was living inside her own atmosphere. The smell of the fur rug was stronger now, warmed slightly by her body heat. It was a musky animal scent that clashed with the sterile smell of the ice. It was the smell of biology fighting against geology. She shifted her legs, a slow, heavy movement that required focused intention. Her knees were stiff, the joints feeling like rusty hinges. The layers of wool and velvet rustled, a dry, papery sound. She felt the texture of the seat beneath her. The velvet was crushed, the pile flattened in the direction of the travel. She ran a gloved finger along the seam of the cushion. The leather piping was hard, cold as wire. Every material in the carriage had been transformed by the temperature, turned into a harder, more brittle version of itself. The horses plodded on. Their endurance was a miracle of biology, muscles contracting and relaxing, hearts pumping, lungs exchanging gas. They were machines of heat in a landscape of entropy. The Duchess listened to the rhythm of their gait. It was slower now, a heavy, dragging walk. They were tired. The swamp was difficult terrain, the mud dragging at the runners even through the ice. She could hear the suck and squelch of the ground beneath the freeze. It was a reminder that the world was not solid, but fluid, merely held in place by the temperature. Lantern flickered, the oil level dropping. The light dimmed for a moment, the shadows stretching out long and grasping before the flame recovered. The pulse of the light was like a slow heartbeat. dim, bright. It changed the emotional tone of the cabin. One moment it was a warm, enclosed refuge. The next it was a dark, cold trap. The Duchess watched the light show with detached interest. She was past the point of fear. The darkness was just another color. The cold was just another texture. They passed a solitary tree, massive and dead, standing alone in a wide circle of black ice. Its branches were twisted into a shape that looked like a screaming face, mouth open to the sky. The lantern light caught the ice in the hollows of the trunk, giving the face glittering, wet eyes. It was a grotesque monument, a sculpture created by chance and rot. The Duchess stared at it as they glided past. It turned slowly, its gaze following the sleigh. Then it was gone, swallowed by the mist and the dark. The track began to rise, leaving the lowest part of the swamp. The ground became firmer, the sound of the runners changing from the dull rumble back to a sharper hiss. The trees began to thin out, the oppressive canopy opening up to reveal the sky again. The stars were there, hard and bright points of light in the black dome. They looked like holes punched in the fabric of the night, revealing a cold fire behind. The moon was lower, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched across the path ahead of them. The transition to the higher ground brought a return of the wind. It started as a whisper in the dry grass that poked through the snow, a soft, sibilant hiss hiss hiss. Then it grew stronger, pressing against the side of the carriage, rocking it gently. The silence of the swamp was left behind, replaced by the white noise of the open air. The Duchess welcomed the sound. It drowned out the beating of her own heart. It drowned out the creaking of the wood. It was a blanket of sound to match the blanket of snow. She felt a deep, overwhelming drowsiness. It was not the sleep of exhaustion, but the sleep of preservation. Her body wanted to shut down, to lower its metabolic rate to match the surroundings. Her eyelids were heavy, dragging down like lead weights. She let them close for a moment. The darkness was instant and complete. In the dark, she could feel the motion of the sleigh more acutely. The pitch and roll, the vibration of the runners. It felt like she was falling slowly through a dark shaft that had no bottom. She forced her eyes open. Not yet, the journey was not over. She had to bear witness to the ride. That was her duty, to see the nothingness, to watch the void. She focused on the window again. The frost had grown new patterns, feathers of ice that curled and spiraled. They were exquisite, delicate masterpieces that would vanish with the first touch of heat. But there was no heat, so they remained permanent and perfect. The sleigh crested a small rise, and the view opened up slightly. Ahead lay a tract of scrubland, a transitional zone between the swamp and the deep forests of the north. It was a landscape of low bushes and stunted pines, half buried in snow. It looked like a sea of white waves, broken by the dark islands of the vegetation. The visual style was scratchy, rough. The shadows were cross-hatched lines of charcoal. The snow was smudged chalk. The lantern light was a wash of yellow ochre, thin and watery. The coachman cracked the whip, not a strike, but a signal, a sharp snap in the cold air. The horses picked up the pace slightly, sensing the firmer ground. The sleigh moved faster, the wind whistling louder. The sense of urgency was slight but present. They were moving away from the dead place, moving towards the next phase of the night. The Duchess adjusted the collar of her cloak. The wool was scratchy against her neck. It was a sensation, a reminder of the boundary between her skin and the world. She tucked her chin down, burying the lower half of her face in the fur. The air inside the collar was warm, moist. She breathed it in, recycling her own heat. It was a small, private ecosystem, a loop of warmth in a universe of cold. The journey stretched out. The scrubland passed by in a blur of gray and white. The rhythm of the runners was a constant driving force. Hiss, glide, it smoothed out the thoughts, erased the worries, flattened the mind. There was no past, there was no future, there was only the sleigh, the snow, and the night. The Duchess sat in her corner, a dark jewel in a wooden box, sliding endlessly across the face of the frozen world. The cold had become a structure. It held her upright. It froze her spine into a straight line. It stiffened the fabric of her dress into a supporting shell. She was supported by the very thing that was trying to consume her. It was a symbiotic relationship. The cold needed a witness, and she needed the cold to define her exile. Without the cold, she was just a woman in a carriage. With the cold, she was a tragedy. She was a story. She was the Duchess of the Winter. The snow dust continued to fall, a curtain of glitter. The lantern light caught the flakes, turning them into a tunnel of sparks. The sleigh drove into this tunnel deeper and deeper. The world behind vanished. The world ahead was invisible. There was only the tunnel of light and snow. The Duchess watched the sparks fly. They were like stars born and dying in a split second. Thousands of them, millions of them, a galaxy of snow. She rested her head against the wall. The vibration hummed in her skull. It was a song, a low monophonic drone. The sound of the earth turning, the sound of the ice growing, the sound of the sleep. She listened and she waited and she rode. The landscape shifted again, shedding the chaotic geometry of the scrubland for a somber, regimented desolation. They had entered the burnt woods, a vast tract of land where a fire, decades or perhaps a century ago, had consumed the forest down to its bones. The trees here were not merely dead, they were charred monuments to a long-forgotten heat. They stood in endless, silent rows, black pillars of carbonized wood rising from the pristine white snow. The contrast was stark, absolute, and blinding in its simplicity. It was a world drawn entirely in heavy charcoal strokes on textured white paper, the darkness of the trunks so deep it seemed to absorb the faint light of the stars, while the snow reflected the moon with a ghostly, blue-white luminescence. The sleigh moved through this graveyard of ash with a respectful, dampened rhythm. The ground beneath the snow was uneven, carpeted with the fallen debris of the ancient fire, logs that had turned to stone-hard charcoal, stumps that hid beneath the drifts like treacherous jagged teeth. The runners of the carriage navigated this terrain with a grinding, gritty sound. It was no longer the clean hiss of the ice or the soft crunch of the powder. It was a harsh, rasping friction, the sound of iron chewing through layers of frozen ash and crystal. Grind, hiss, crunch, grind, hiss, crunch. The vibration transmitted through the floorboards was sharper, a high-frequency trembling that traveled up the Duchess's legs and settled as a dull buzz in her knees. The air in the burnt woods was distinct. Even through the sealed, frost-coated windows, the Duchess imagined she could smell it. It was a dry, acrid scent, stripped of all moisture. It smelled of cold dust, of ancient smoke trapped in the cellular structure of the wood, released now by the extreme cold. It was the scent of a library that had burned down and then frozen over. The atmosphere was incredibly dry, sucking the moisture from her eyes and throat. She swallowed, a dry, clicking sound in the silence of the cabin. Her tongue felt like a piece of rough felt. The water in the canteen tucked in the door pocket was surely a block of ice by now, useless and solid. Visually, the scene was a study in verticality. The trunks were straight, limbless, stripped of their branches by the intensity of the past fire. They looked like the bars of a massive, planet-sized cage. As the sleigh passed them, the parallax effect created a dizzying optical illusion. The trees in the foreground moved fast, blurring into a wall of black streaks. The trees in the background moved slowly, standing like sentinels watching the procession. The Duchess found herself tracking individual trunks. A thick one scarred with a long vertical fissure. A thin one bent slightly at the top like a broken finger. A cluster of three fused together at the base. She watched them approach, slide past the window, and vanish into the darkness behind. It was a conveyor belt of carbon. The lantern light struggled here. The black wood absorbed the yellow beams, refusing to reflect anything back. The light seemed to die a few feet from the carriage, swallowed by the insatiable darkness of the trees. The only things that caught the light were the snowflakes. They were falling again, not as dust, but as large, heavy flakes that spiraled down between the black pillars. In the amber glow of the lamp, they looked like sparks of fire, a ghostly reenactment of the conflagration that had created this place. They danced and swirled, landing on the charred wood, decorating the black skeletons with delicate lace collars of white. The Duchess shifted her position, the movement microscopic in the heavy layers of her clothing. The wool of her cloak had become stiff with the cold, the fibers locking together to form a rigid shell. She felt less like a person wearing clothes and more like a soft creature inhabiting a hard carapace. The fur rug over her lap was a heavy weight, pressing her down into the seat. She welcomed the weight. It was grounding. It kept her from floating away into the gray fugue state that threatened to overtake her mind. She ran her gloved hand over the fur against the grain. The coarse hairs bristled, stiff and resisting. She smoothed them back down. A simple task. Stroke up, stroke down. Order, disorder, order, disorder. The wind had changed its voice. In the open moor it had been a roar. In the gorge a whistle. Here among the fluted columns of the burnt trees it was a hollow, breathy sound. It moved through the gaps in the wood like air blown over the mouth of a giant bottle. Whoop, whoop, whoop. It was a low, mournful note, constant and unvarying. It provided a bass track to the treble scratch of the runners. The two sounds locked together, creating a drone that was hypnotic, sedative, and utterly devoid of hope. Inside the carriage, the shadows were hard and angular. The light from the lantern, unable to diffuse in the black forest, cast sharp, distinct shapes that lay across the floor and the seat. The shadow of the window frame was a perfect black grid on the velvet cushion opposite her. She watched the grid warp and stretch as the sleigh rocked over the uneven ground. It looked like a prison window made of shadow, expanding and contracting, breathing with the motion of the ride. She placed her hand in the center of one of the shadow squares. Her glove disappeared into the darkness. She pulled it back into the light. Now you see it, now you don't. A magic trick for an audience of one. The cold was penetrating deeper now. It had bypassed the defenses of the wool and the fur and was attacking the structure of the carriage itself. The wood of the door frame was shrinking, pulling away from the metal latch. She could hear the mechanism rattling, a loose metallic chattering that spoke of the structural stress. The varnish on the interior panels seemed to have clouded, turning from a rich, glossy brown to a dull, milky haze. The cold was aging the vehicle, accelerating the process of decay. It was turning the sleigh into an artifact before it even reached its destination. The Duchess looked at the coachman through the peephole she had maintained in the frost. He was a statue of gray wool and ice. Snow had piled up on his shoulders, forming white epaulets. His hat was a mound of white. He did not move his head. He did not raise his whip. He simply sat, his hands wrapped in the reins, letting the horses find the path. The horses were dark ghosts, their coats matted with sweat that had frozen into icicles at the tips of their hair. Their breath was a continuous, rolling fog that engulfed the driver's bench. They were walking engines, burning their own bodies to keep the wheels turning. The Duchess felt a pang of sympathy, distant and cold. They were all trapped in the same loop of duty. The path through the burnt woods was straight, a linear cut through the chaos of the trees. It seemed to have no end. The perspective lines converged in the distance, vanishing into a point of absolute blackness. It was a tunnel with no exit. The repetition of the trees was maddening. Black trunk, white snow, black trunk, white snow. It was a binary code of nature, repeating a message that she could not decipher. It said, endure, endure, endure. She closed her eyes, seeking the visual relief of the dark. But even behind her eyelids, she saw the stripes. The afterimage of the trees was burned into her retina, vertical bars of light and dark. She pressed her palms against her eyes, the leather gloves cool and hard against her brow. She applied pressure, watching the phosphines explode in the darkness, geometric patterns of neon blue and green that swirled and faded. It was the only color she had seen in hours. She watched the internal light show, a private cinema of the mind. The sleigh lurched, the right runner dropping into unseen hollow. The carriage tilted violently, throwing the Duchess against the side wall. Her shoulder struck the wood with a dull thud. She didn't gasp, she didn't cry out. She simply absorbed the impact, letting the heavy clothing cushion the blow. She stayed there for a moment, leaning against the cold wall, listening to the carriage right itself. The springs groaned, a long, drawn-out complaint of metal under torture. Then the rhythm resumed. Grind, hiss, crunch. The interruption was over. The status quo was restored. She focused on the vibration in her feet. It was the only connection she had to the earth. Through the soles of her boots, through the wood of the floor, through the iron of the runners, she could feel the texture of the world. She could feel the hardness of the charcoal logs, the brittleness of the ice, the density of the packed snow. It was a tactile map of the terrain, read through the bones of her legs. She imagined she could feel the history of the fire in the vibrations, the crackle of the flames, the falling of the timber, the cooling of the ash. It was all there, recorded in the ground, played back by the runners. The time was indeterminate. The concept of hour had dissolved. There was only the duration of the ride. The Duchess felt ancient. She felt as if she had been riding in this sleigh since she was a child, and she would be riding in it until she was an old woman. The manor was a myth. The destination was a fable. The reality was the wood, the cold, and the trees. She was the exiled Duchess, the eternal passenger, the lady of the perpetual winter. She looked at the frost on the window again. It had thickened, the crystals growing larger, more aggressive. They were no longer delicate ferns. They were thick, jagged spikes of ice that looked like shark teeth. They were growing inward, encroaching on her space, consuming the air. She watched a single crystal catch the light. It acted as a prism, breaking the yellow lantern light into a tiny, microscopic rainbow. A speck of red, a speck of blue. It was startlingly beautiful. A universe of color trapped in a frozen tear. She stared at it, entranced, until the angle of the light changed and the rainbow vanished, leaving only the dull gray ice. The wind outside began to pick up, blowing the loose snow from the ground into low, swirling clouds. The gray blizzard had begun. The air was filled with a mixture of fresh snow and old ash, creating a dirty, gritty fog that obscured the trees. The world shrank, the visibility dropped to a few yards. The sleigh was now moving through a cloud of gray particulate matter. The sound of the wind rose to a howl, chaotic noise that drowned out the runners. It sounded like the forest was screaming. The carriage rocked more violently now, buffeted by the gusts. The Duchess felt the instability of the vehicle. It felt top-heavy, fragile. A strong enough gust could tip it over, spilling her out into the frozen ash. She gripped the strap again, her hand tightening around the leather. She was holding on to the idea of safety rather than safety itself. If the sleigh tipped, the strap would not save her. But the act of holding on gave her a focus. It engaged the muscles of her arm, reminding her that she was still in control of her own body, if nothing else. She listened to the sounds of the storm. The sand-blasting sound of the ice crystals hitting the wooden panels, the rattle of the door, the creak of the roof. It was a symphony of resistance. The sleigh was fighting the wind, pushing through the wall of air. It was a battle of wills, the inanimate determination of the storm versus the stubborn endurance of the carriage. The Duchess was the prize in the center, the silent observer of the conflict. The temperature dropped again. She could feel it. It was a physical weight pressing down on her head, her shoulders. It was trying to crush her. She tucked her chin deeper into the fur. She wiggled her toes, a desperate check for sensation. The response was faint, a dull, distant awareness that she still had feet. The numbness was creeping up her ankles, turning her legs into pillars of wood. She imagined herself turning into one of the trees outside, black, frozen, immobile. Rooted in the ash, waiting for a spring that would never arrive. The sleigh slowed. The horses were struggling against the wind and the deep drifts of ash snow. She could hear their labored breathing, a desperate gasping for air that was too thin and too cold. The coachman shouted something, a low, guttural command that was torn away by the wind. The whip cracked, a dull sound in the thick air. The horses surged forward, a spasm of effort that shook the carriage. They were fighting for every inch. The ride had become a crawl. The Duchess watched the window. The frost was now so thick she couldn't see the trees at all. The peephole she had made had frozen over again. She was blind, sealed in the box. The world was entirely auditory and tactile. The roar of the wind, the vibration of the floor, the cold on her face, the smell of the old smoke. It was a sensory deprivation tank designed to strip away the layers of the self until only the core remained. And the core was cold. She thought of the fire in the hearth at the manor. The orange flames licking the logs, the heat radiating out, warming the stone, warming the skin. It seemed like a fantasy, a story from a different planet. How could fire exist in a universe made of ice? How could warmth survive in a vacuum? The cold felt like the only truth. The heat was a lie, a temporary aberration in the natural order of things. The universe wanted to be cold. It wanted to be still. It was returning to its natural state, and she was just a witness to the process. The sleigh found a patch of smoother ground. The rocking ceased. The runners hissed again, a cleaner sound. The wind seemed to drop slightly, or perhaps the trees were thicker here, blocking the gusts. The rhythm returned, hiss, grind, hiss, grind. The Duchess relaxed her grip on the strap. Her hand was stiff, claw-like. She massaged her fingers, trying to work the blood back into the joints. It was a painful process, the sensation returning as a burning ache. She welcomed the pain. Pain was life. Numbness was death. She looked at the ceiling of the carriage. In the flickering light, the tufted buttons looked like eyes staring down at her. Dark, unblinking eyes. She stared back. It was a staring contest with the furniture. The furniture was winning. It had more patience. It had no need for warmth. It belonged to the cold. Smell of the ash intensified. They must be passing through a section where the fire had been particularly hot, where the ground itself had been scorched. The scent was overpowering, dry, dusty, choking. It tasted of carbon and time. The Duchess coughed, a small, dry cough that hurt her chest. The air was too dry. It was pulling the water out of her lungs. She covered her mouth with the muff, breathing through the velvet and fur. It helped slightly. It added a layer of moisture to the air, a filter against the dryness. The journey continued through the burnt cathedral. Mile after mile of black columns, mile after mile of white snow. The mind reeled at the scale of the destruction. How many trees? 1 million, 10 million, all dead, all standing, all watching. The sleigh was a speck of life moving through a necropolis of wood. The Duchess felt small, insignificant, a brief spark in the endless night. She closed her eyes again and let the rhythm take her. She was drifting deeper into the trance. The boundary between her body and the carriage was dissolving. She felt the runners as her own feet. She felt the wind on the wood as the wind on her skin. She was the sleigh. She was the ride. She was the exile. The darkness of the forest seemed to seep into the carriage, staining the air. The light from the lantern was turning browner, dimmer. The battery of the oil was running low. The flame was shrinking, retreating from the cold. The shadows lengthened, merging together, swallowing the floor, the seat, her legs. Soon there would be only the dark. The Duchess waited for it. She was not afraid. The dark was restful. The dark was quiet. The dark was the end of the struggle. But the light held a tiny, stubborn point of yellow in the heart of the black woods. It refused to go out. It continued to illuminate the frost, the velvet, the glove. It was the anchor that kept her from drifting away completely. She focused on it, the light, the fire, the memory of the sun. The runners hit a stone, a sharp crack. The carriage jumped, the Duchess swayed, the rhythm broke, then resumed. The horses plodded on. The wind moaned, the trees stood. The snow fell. The sleigh rode on to nowhere, carrying its cargo of silence and wool through the heart of the burnt world. The transition from the burnt woods to the expanse that lay beyond was not a sudden boundary, but a slow, agonizing erasure of verticality. The blackened pillars of the dead trees did not simply stop. They became sparser, their intervals stretching out from yards to furlongs, until the sleigh was moving through a vast, empty punctuation of the night. Finally, the last charred stump drifted past the window, a solitary black tooth in the white gum of the landscape, and vanished into the gloom behind. With its departure, the world flattened. The horizon, which had been obscured by the forest, now stretched out in an infinite, terrifyingly straight line, separating the indigo weight of the sky from the pale, bruised blue of the snow. They had entered the white waste, a plateau of high-altitude tundra where nothing grew, nothing stood, and nothing lived. It was a place of absolute geological stillness, a canvas of snow and ice that had been scoured smooth by the wind for 10,000 years. The visual aesthetic shifted from the high-contrast charcoal of the woods to a soft, blurred study in gradients. The snow here was not a solid white, but a shifting palette of slate grays, deep azures, and faint, pearlescent silvers, illuminated by the distant, unblinking eye of the moon. It looked like a drawing made on heavy, dark paper with soft pastels, the colors smudged by a thumb to create a hazy, dreamlike atmosphere where the ground and the sky blended together into a single, seamless void. The wind, no longer broken by the trees, arrived with the force of a solid object. It was a steady, relentless pressure that leaned against the side of the sleigh, pushing it continuously to the left. The coachman had to compensate, angling the horses slightly into the gale, creating a crab-like motion where the carriage moved diagonally forward. The sound was deafening yet monotonous, a constant roaring drone that wrapped around the wooden cabin like a blanket of white noise. It was the sound of air moving over a planet that had no features to slow it down. It vibrated in the glass of the windows, a high-frequency buzzing that the Duchess could feel in the tips of her teeth. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere had undergone a subtle change. The dry, acrid smell of the burnt wood was gone, replaced by a scent that was almost frightening in its purity. It was the smell of ozone, of crushed ice, of the upper atmosphere. It smelled of nothingness. It was cold, sharp, and sterile, entering the nose like a mist of rubbing alcohol. The air felt thin, rarefied. The Duchess found herself taking deeper breaths, her chest rising and falling against the heavy weight of the furs, trying to pull enough oxygen from the freezing ether to keep her blood moving. The cold here was aggressive. It was not just a lack of heat. It was a presence, an invisible invader that sought out every weakness in the carriage's defenses. It found the gap between the door and the frame, sending a razor-thin slice of draft cutting across the floor. It found the screw holes in the handle, radiating a circle of chill into the velvet. The Duchess felt the temperature dropping minute by minute. The leather of the seat beneath her had turned into a block of frozen stone. The heat she had managed to bank in the furs was slowly being leached away, drawn out by the vacuum of the night. She huddled deeper into her cocoon, pulling her knees up, wrapping her arms around them inside the cloak, turning herself into a sphere of wool and survival. She watched the lantern light through the side of the window. In this open space, the light had nothing to reflect off but the snow itself. It created a traveling pool of yellow illumination that moved alongside the sleigh, a small, lonely circle of warmth in the blue vastness. Within this circle, the wind-blown snow moved in horizontal streaks, driven parallel to the ground by the gale. They looked like lines of static on a broken screen, a constant rushing stream of white particles that mesmerized the eye. The speed of the snow made the sleigh feel as if it were standing still, anchored in place while the universe rushed past it. The mesmerizing quality of the horizontal snow induced a deep trance. The Duchess's eyes unfocused. She was no longer looking at the snow, she was looking at the motion itself. The endless stream of particles became a fluid, a river of light flowing through the dark. She felt a sensation of detachment, as if her mind were floating free of her body, hovering somewhere in the upper corner of the carriage, looking down at the pile of furs that contained the Duchess. She saw herself as an object, a piece of cargo, a relic being transported across the void. The sound of the runners had changed again. On the hard-packed, wind-polished snow of the waste, they no longer hissed or crunched. They sang. It was a high, keen note, like a wet finger run around the rim of a crystal glass. E-e. The sound was pure, piercing, and unrelenting. It rose and fell slightly in pitch as the speed of the horses varied, but it never stopped. It was the song of iron on ice, a cold, metallic melody that pierced the roar of the wind. The Duchess listened to it. She tried to harmonize with it in her head, humming a silent note that matched the frequency of the runners. It was a way to join the machine, to become part of the sleigh. The horses were suffering. She could sense it through the frame of the carriage. Their gait was heavy, plodding. There was no spring in their step, only the heavy placement of one hoof after another. She imagined their heads down, chins tucked against their chests to protect their airways from the biting wind. Their coats would be frosted over, turning them into white ghost horses. The steam from their breath would be swept away instantly, leaving no trace. They were the engines of this journey, biological machines converting hay and oats into motion, fighting a losing battle against the thermodynamics of the tundra. The Duchess focused on the interior of the door again. The frost on the window had changed its character once more. In the burnt woods, it had been jagged and aggressive. Here in the dry, intense cold of the waste, it was geometric, crystalline. The ice had formed into perfect, interlocking hexagons, a honeycomb of white growing across the glass. It was ordered, precise, mathematical. It looked like a map of a city built by insects. She traced the lines of the hexagons with her eyes. Up, right, down, left, up, right, down, left. The pattern was infinite. It was a fractal of cold. She wondered what time it was. The concept seemed absurd. Time required change, and there was no change here. There was only the wind, the snow, and the dark. The sun was a myth from a previous life. The day was a story told to children. This was the eternal night. The Duchess felt a strange peace in this realization. If there was no time, there was no urgency. There was no deadline. There was only the ride. The ride was the state of being. A sudden gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed into the broadside of the carriage. The sleigh shuddered violently, sliding sideways on the ice for a few feet before the runners bit in again. The lantern swung wildly, the light flaring and dimming. The shadows inside the cabin lurched, leaping from the floor to the ceiling in a disorienting dance. The Duchess was pressed hard against the velvet wall, the padding compressing under her shoulder. She did not flinch. She rode the lurch like a sailor rides a wave. When the sleigh steadied, she simply settled back into her corner, the fur rug undisturbed. The recovery of the horses was slow. They had been knocked off their rhythm. The sound of the hooves was out of sync for a moment, clop clop stumble clop, before finding the beat again. The coachman did not shout. He knew better than to waste his breath in this wind. He communicated through the reins, through the subtle shifts in tension that told the animals he was still there, still guiding them, still awake in the white nightmare. The landscape outside began to undulate. The flat plateau was breaking up into a series of low, rolling dunes of snow. The sleigh rose and fell, a slow, oceanic motion that was nauseatingly rhythmic. Up the long face of a dune, the runners singing a lower note, the horses straining. Over the crest, the wind hitting them with renewed fury. Down the other side, the sleigh picking up speed, the runners screaming, the carriage rocking. It was a roller coaster in slow motion. The Duchess closed her eyes and let the motion take her. Pitch up, pitch down, pitch up, pitch down. It was the breathing of the world. She thought about the destination. Nowhere. The title of the journey was accurate. Even if they arrived at a building, a castle, a village, it would still be nowhere. It would just be another point in the cold. The true destination was the state of mind she was in now. The emptiness, the silence, the numbness. She had already arrived. The physical movement was just a formality. Her feet were gone. She could no longer feel them at all. They were heavy weights at the end of her legs, anchoring her to the floor. She tried to visualize them inside the boots, the wool socks, the leather, the skin. Were they blue? Were they white? It didn't matter. They were silent. The cold had silenced the nerves, shut down the communication lines. It was a mercy. If she could feel them, they would be screaming in pain. The numbness was a gift. She moved her hand inside the muff. The silk lining was cool, but warmer than the air. She touched her left hand with her right. The leather gloves were stiff, cold. She rubbed them together, a dry, rasping sound. Swish, swish. It was the sound of dry leaves. She was becoming a dry leaf, brittle and fragile. If she moved too fast, she might crack. If she spoke, her voice might shatter like glass. So she remained still, silent, whole. The window pane rattled in its frame. Tack, 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 a loose fitting agitated by the vibration of the runners. The sound was annoying at first, a discordant note in the drone of the wind. But soon the Duchess incorporated it into the symphony. Drone, scream, tack, 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 drone. It became a percussion instrument. She waited for it. She anticipated it. When the rattle came, she felt a small flicker of satisfaction. The pattern held. The machine was working. Through the hexagonal frost, she saw a change in the light. The moon was passing behind a cloud bank, a thin veil of high-altitude cirrus. The light on the snow dimmed, turning from a bright, sharp blue to a dull, flat gray. The shadows of the dunes softened, losing their hard edges. The world became two-dimensional. The definition of the ground was lost. It was impossible to tell where the snow ended and the sky began. The sleigh was floating in a gray void. This was the whiteout, the erasure of depth. The coachman slowed the horses. Without the shadows to define the terrain, the risk of stumbling into a drift or a hollow was too great. The pace dropped to a crawl. The singing of the runners deepened to a low growl. The wind sounded louder now, deprived of the competition from the wheels. Woo-hoo. It sounded like a giant exhaling. The carriage rocked gently, a cradle in the void. The slowness was agonizing. It stretched the seconds into hours. The Duchess felt the lack of momentum as a physical heaviness. The inertia that had pinned her to the seat was gone, replaced by a static weight. She felt every bump, every shift of the chassis. She wanted to sleep, to truly sleep, but the cold kept her on the edge of consciousness. It was a watchful sleep, a hibernation with one eye open. She looked at the ceiling again. The shadows, there were deep pools of ink. She imagined faces in the shadows, old friends, ancestors. They looked down at her with indifferent eyes. They were not judging her, they were just watching. They were the audience of the sleep story. She was the performer, and her performance consisted of sitting perfectly still in a moving box. It was a demanding role. It required absolute discipline. The sleigh crested a particularly high dune, and for a moment the cloud cover broke. The moon struck the snow with blinding intensity. The world snapped back into 3D, the shadows reappeared sharp as knives. The crystals on the snow glittered like a field of diamonds. The sudden brightness was shocking. The Duchess blinked, her eyes watering. The tears felt cold on her lashes, freezing instantly into tiny beads of ice. She wiped them away with the back of her glove. The leather scratched her cheek. The pain was sharp, real. They descended the dune, gathering speed. The horses seemed energized by the return of the light. They picked up the trot again. The runners sang. The wind roared, the rhythm was restored, the Duchess settled back. The crisis of the slowdown was over. The journey resumed its inexorable progress. She began to count the breaths of the carriage. Every time the frame creaked, that was a breath. Creak 1, creak 2, creak 3. She counted to 100, then she started over. It was a way to measure the infinite, breaking eternity down into manageable chunks of wood-grown. The landscape outside began to show subtle signs of change again. The rolling dunes were flattening out. Small, dark shapes appeared in the snow, rocks scoured bare by the wind. They looked like black islands in the white sea. Then larger shapes, boulders, outcroppings of granite that pushed up through the ice crust. They were entering a field of stone. The white waste was giving way to the frozen garden of rocks. The sleigh navigated between the boulders. The path was winding again, following the path of least resistance. The carriage swayed left, swayed right. The shadows of the rocks were long and menacing, stretching across the path like barriers. The horses stepped over the shadows, breaking them. The sleigh sliced through them. Shadow, light, shadow, light. The strobe effect returned, slower this time, more deliberate. The Duchess watched a massive boulder pass by on the right. It was capped with a mushroom of snow, a ridiculous white hat on a stern gray face. It looked like a troll frozen in stone. She felt a flicker of amusement, a dry, dusty emotion that vanished as quickly as it came. Humor required energy. There was no energy to spare. The cold was now inside her clothes. It had breached the final layer. She could feel it on her skin, a cool caress that was slowly turning into a grip. Her stomach felt cold, her heart felt cold. She visualized her heart as a pump made of ice, pushing slush through her veins. It beat slowly. Thump, pause, thump, pause. It was the rhythm of a reptile in winter. She wondered if the coachman was still alive. She hadn't seen him move in miles. He was just a shape on the box. Perhaps he had frozen solid and the horses were just following the road from memory. The thought didn't frighten her. It seemed appropriate. A dead driver for an exiled passenger, a ghost ship on the snow. But then she heard the crack of the whip, a sharp, distinct sound in the thin air. He was alive. He was awake. The illusion was broken. The wind began to die down as they moved deeper into the rock field. The boulders were breaking the airflow, creating pockets of calm. The roar faded to a moan, then to a whisper. The silence of the ground returned, heavier than before. The sound of the runners became the only sound in the universe. Hiss, hiss, hiss. It was loud, intrusive. It sounded like the carriage was whispering secrets to the ice. The Duchess closed her eyes. She was tired of looking, tired of the blue and the gray and the white. She wanted the black. She let her head fall forward slightly, her chin resting on her chest. The fur collar came up to meet her cheek. It was soft, ticklish. She breathed into it. The air was warm. She stayed there. Drifting, floating, the sleigh was no longer a vehicle. It was a capsule floating in space. She was an astronaut of the 19th century traveling to the moon in a box of velvet and wood. The cold was the vacuum. The stars were the destination. The horses were the rockets. She heard a sound, a low, resonant boom, the ice shifting under the snow, a rock cracking in the frost. It sounded like a drum beat from deep underground. It vibrated through the floor. It was the heartbeat of the planet, slow, heavy, ancient. It told her that the earth was asleep too. The whole world was sleeping. She was just joining the slumber. The sleigh moved on, threading the needle between the black rocks. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like spirits following the carriage. The Duchess didn't see them. She was deep inside the wool, deep inside the cold, deep inside the sleep. The ride to nowhere continued, a steady, hypnotic slide through the frozen heart of the night. The field of scattered boulders and wind-scoured granite gradually began to constrict, the dark islands of stone drawing closer together until they merged into continuous towering walls. The sleigh had entered the Gallery of Whispers, a narrow, winding mountain pass carved by glacial meltwater eons ago, now frozen into a corridor of absolute silence. The visual landscape shifted from the horizontal expanse of the waste to a vertical claustrophobia. The walls rose up on either side, sheer cliffs of rock glazed with thick sheets of ice that cascaded down from the heights like frozen waterfalls. In the dim lantern light, these ice flows did not look white. They looked like obsidian and dark quartz, slick, heavy, and impenetrable. The vintage pastel aesthetic became a study in deep, saturated blacks and bruised purples, with only the faintest highlights of sickly yellow where the lamp caught the wet sheen of the ice. The acoustic environment changed instantly. The wind, which had been a constant companion on the plateau, was abruptly cut off by the high walls. The roaring drone vanished, leaving behind a silence so sudden and so profound that it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. It was a vacuum of sound. In this void, the microscopic noises of the sleigh were magnified to an almost uncomfortable degree. The creak of the leather harness sounded like the groaning of a ship's timber. The breathing of the horses was a loud, rhythmic rasping, hew-huff, that echoed off the hard surfaces of the pass. The runners, now sliding on pure, glass-like ice that coated the floor of the canyon, made a sound that was no longer a hiss but a high, singing resonance, a vibration that seemed to originate from inside the Duchess's own skull. The incline of the pass was steep. The horses slowed to a labored crawl, their hooves striking the ice with a sharp, metallic clack-clack that rang out like hammer blows in a cathedral. The sleigh tilted backward, the angle pressing the Duchess deep into the corner of the velvet seat. She felt the gravity as a heavy hand on her chest, pinning her down, merging her spine with the wooden frame of the carriage. She surrendered to the weight. It was easier not to fight. To sit upright required muscular tension, which required energy, which required heat. To slump, to recline, to become liquid, that was the path of least resistance. That was the way of the ice. The air in the gallery was stagnant, a pool of cold that had not moved for centuries. It was denser than the air on the plain, heavier. It tasted of wet stone and iron. The Duchess breathed it in shallow sips, feeling the chill coat the back of her throat with a layer of frost. Her breath no longer formed a cloud. The air was so cold that the moisture froze instantly upon exhalation, falling as a fine, invisible dust on the fur of her collar. She could feel the tiny crystals accumulating on her upper lip, a delicate mustache of ice. She did not wipe it away. To move her hand from the warmth of the muff would be a foolish expenditure of calorie. She let the ice grow. She was becoming part of the sculpture. She watched the walls of the pass slide by through the thick hexagonal frost of the window. The lantern light played tricks in the narrow corridor. It reflected off the ice sheets, creating phantom lights that traveled alongside the carriage, dim, distorted reflections of the lamp that looked like other sleighs, other travelers trapped in the ice, moving in parallel through the dark. She watched these ghost lights with a detached curiosity. Were they reflections or were they memories? Was she seeing the past journeys of this sleigh, the ghosts of previous exiles? The thought floated through her mind like a slow-moving fish in a dark pond, creating no ripples of fear, only a mild intellectual engagement. The texture of the ride was smooth, glass smooth. The friction was almost zero. If the horses stopped pulling, the sleigh would likely slide backward, accelerating down the pass until it crashed into the boulders below. But the horses pulled. Their iron shoes were studded for this exact terrain, biting into the ice with every step. Crunch, pull, slide, crunch, pull, slide. It was a rhythm of precarious survival. The Duchess felt the tension in the drawbar, the shudder of the chassis as the weight shifted. She was suspended on a wire of tension between the strength of the animals and the pull of the abyss. Inside the carriage, the cold had conquered everything. The velvet of the seats was hard as wood, the pile frozen stiff. The leather straps were rigid. The floorboards were covered in a thin sheen of rime where the draft had leaked in. The Duchess felt her own body becoming an object. Her legs were heavy logs, her hands were stones. Her face was a mask of cold porcelain. Only deep inside, in the very center of her torso, was there a faint hum of warmth, the pilot light of her life keeping the machine running. She visualized this light as a small blue flame burning quietly in a dark room. She focused all her attention on protecting it, wrapping her mind around it like a cupped hand. The pass wound left, then right, a serpentine path through the mountains. The turns were sharp and the sleigh swung wide, the rear runners skidding toward the wall before catching. The Duchess swayed with the motion, her head lolling slightly against the cushion. She saw the rock wall pass inches from the window, a blur of black wet stone and gray ice. She could see the veins in the rock, the cracks, the dripping moisture. It was a geology lesson at close quarters. She saw a fern, frozen green and perfect in a block of clear ice, a relic of a summer 1,000 years ago. It passed in a second, but the image lingered in her mind. A perfect, frozen life, preserved, safe, dead. The concept of exile began to shift in her mind. It was no longer a punishment, it was a state of grace. To be exiled was to be removed from the chaos of the world, from the noise, the demands, the heat of human interaction. Here in the ice gallery there was only peace. There was only the silence and the slow, rhythmic motion. She was not being sent away, she was being sent into the quiet, into the dark. It was a return to the womb of the world, a cold, stone womb where she could sleep for an eternity. The lantern flickered violently as a drop of condensation fell from the roof of the lamp onto the hot glass chimney. A hiss, a pop, and the light dimmed to a mere spark before flaring back up. For a moment, the darkness in the carriage was absolute. In that second of blackness, the Duchess felt the true weight of the mountain above her. Tons of rock, tons of ice pressing down on the small wooden box. She felt buried alive, but the panic did not come. Instead, a feeling of comfort washed over her. To be buried was to be safe, to be hidden, to be done. When the light returned, it seemed weaker, more orange. The oil was surely running low. The flame was consuming the last of the fuel, feeding on the dregs. The shadows in the cabin grew longer, softer. They reached out from the corners, wrapping around her feet, her knees. They were soft blankets of darkness. She welcomed them. She watched the shadow of the strap swing back and forth. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was slower now. The pendulum was losing energy. Time itself was slowing down, grinding to a halt in the cold air. The horses slowed even further as the incline steepened near the top of the pass. They were heaving, their breath coming in explosive bursts that sounded like steam valves releasing pressure. Choo, choo. The sleigh moved inches at a time. The runners sang a low, mournful note, barely a vibration. The Duchess could feel the struggle in her own muscles, a sympathetic straining. She pushed against the floor with her numb feet, as if she could help push the carriage up the hill. It was a futile gesture, but it connected her to the effort. We are climbing. We are ascending to the peak of the night. The walls of the pass began to recede slightly, stepping back to reveal ledges of snow-covered rock. On these ledges sat shapes that looked like statues, hoodoos of stone capped with snow eroded by the wind into human-like forms. They looked like a procession of monks, heads bowed, watching the sleigh pass. The Duchess nodded to them, a silent greeting from one frozen traveler to another. They were the guardians of the pass, the silent witnesses. They had seen 1,000 sleighs, 1,000 winters. They would see 1,000 more. The air grew thinner. The Duchess felt a slight dizziness, a lightness in the head. The lack of oxygen was enhancing the trance. Her thoughts became floaty, disconnected. She saw images that weren't there, a fire in the snow, a wolf with eyes of gold, a castle made of glass. They drifted across her vision like lantern slides superimposed over the dark reality of the rock walls. She watched them without judgment. They were just dreams leaking into the waking world. The barrier between sleep and wakefulness was dissolving. A sudden, loud crack echoed through the canyon. A stone falling from the heights, striking the ice below, cracked thud. The sound was violent, intrusive. The horses shied, a chaotic scrambling of hooves on the ice. The sleigh jerked sideways, hitting the wall with a jarring crunch. The Duchess was thrown against the door, her shoulder taking the impact. The pain was dull, distant, filtered through the layers of wool and the numbness of her flesh. She righted herself slowly. The sleigh straightened. The rhythm resumed. But the silence had been broken. The mountain had spoken. It had reminded them of its power. She rubbed her arm, feeling the shape of the bruise forming under the cloth. It was a souvenir of the mountain, a kiss from the rock. She accepted it. It was better to feel pain than to feel nothing. It proved she was still soft, still breakable, still human. The stone was hard, she was soft. That was the dynamic. The sleigh crested the summit of the pass. The ground leveled out. The strain on the horses released. The runners stopped their grinding and began to glide again. The feeling of weightlessness returned. They were at the top of the world. The walls fell away completely, and suddenly the sky was back, a massive, overwhelming dome of stars, brighter and closer than she had ever seen them. They looked like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. The Milky Way was a frozen river of milk spilled across the zenith. The beauty was cold, distant, and terrifying. The wind returned, but gently this time. A high-altitude breeze that whispered over the open snow. It was a hushing sound, the earth telling the sky to be quiet. The sleigh moved across the high saddle of the mountain range, a flat expanse of rock and ice suspended in the clouds. The view was limitless. She could see for miles in every direction, a sea of mountain peaks, white waves frozen in mid-break. It was a landscape of total desolation. No trees, no lights, no life. Just the geology of the winter. The Duchess looked down at the world below. It was a dark abyss, a pool of shadows. She was above it all, exiled not just from her home, but from the earth itself. She was riding in the sky. The thought made her feel light, ethereal. She was a ghost in a carriage, flying over the mountains. The descent began. It was not a plunge, but a slow, winding path down the other side of the range. The sleigh tipped forward. Gravity became an ally, pulling them down. The horses picked up speed, their hooves finding a trotting rhythm. Clip-clop, clip-clop. The sound was lighter, happier. The runners hissed with a higher pitch. The carriage swayed with a more fluid motion. They were going down, down into the valley, down into the heavy air, down into the sleep. The Duchess leaned back, letting the gravity hold her. She felt the tension drain from her neck, from her shoulders. The hard part was over. The climb was done. Now there was only the slide, the long, endless slide into the dark. She closed her eyes and let the sensation of falling take over. It was a controlled fall, a falling without hitting the bottom. She listened to the wind whistling past the window. It sounded like a flute now, playing a simple, repetitive melody. Do-dee-do. She hummed along with it in her mind. It was a lullaby for the descent. The shadows in the carriage began to rotate as the road wound around the mountain. They spun slowly, like the hands of a clock. She kept her eyes closed, but she could feel the movement of the light on her eyelids. Flicker, dark, dark. It was a strobe light for the sleeping mind. The temperature seemed to drop even further as they descended into the shadow of the mountain. The sun would not touch this face of the rock for months. It was the dark side of the world. The cold here was ancient, prehistoric. It was the cold of the Ice Age. The Duchess felt it seeping through the floor, through the boots, through the bone. It was claiming her. It was turning her marrow into ice. She didn't mind. The ice was strong. The ice lasted. To be ice was to be eternal. She felt a sudden vibration, a shudder in the runner. They were crossing a patch of rippled ice, wind-sculpted ridges that acted like a rumble strip. B-R-R-R-R-R-R-R-R-R-R-T. The sound vibrated in her teeth. It shook the drowsiness out of her for a second, bringing her back to the room. She opened her eyes. The frost on the window was thick, opaque. She scratched it again. The ice was harder now, almost stone-like. She managed to clear a tiny pinhole. She looked out. She saw a cliff face passing by, close enough to touch. It was covered in writing, scratches in the rock, natural formations that looked like runes, the language of the mountain. She tried to read it. It said, sleep, wait, cold. It was a simple message. She understood it. The sleigh rounded a sharp bend and the view opened up again. A vast glacier lay before them, a river of ice flowing slowly down the valley. It glowed with a faint blue inner light illuminated by the moon. It was massive, powerful, silent. The sleigh moved onto the edge of the glacier, the runners finding the smooth, blue ice. The ride became perfectly silent. No hiss, no crunch, just the sensation of movement, floating, gliding. The silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It filled the carriage, pushing out the thoughts, pushing out the memories. There was no room for anything else, just the silence. The Duchess sat in the center of it, a small, warm dot in a universe of cold quiet. She folded her hands in her lap, right over left, thumb over thumb, a gesture of composure, a gesture of prayer. She wasn't praying to a god, she was praying to the night. Let it be long, let it be quiet, let it be cold. The lantern burned low, a dying ember. The shadows merged into a single, embracing darkness. The Duchess sat in the gloom, eyes open, seeing nothing, feeling everything. The sleigh slid on, carrying her deeper into the glacier, deeper into the nowhere, deeper into the heart of the sleep story. The glacier was a river of time frozen in its tracks, a colossal tongue of ice that had carved its way down from the mountain peaks over the course of 10,000 years. The sleigh moved across its surface with a profound, unearthly smoothness. There was no friction here, no resistance. The iron runners had found a perfect equilibrium with the blue ice, sliding over the glass-like expanse as if levitating on a cushion of sub-zero air. The sound of the journey had been distilled down to its purest form, a single, continuous, resonant hum that vibrated in the marrow of the Duchess's bones. It was a frequency too low to be heard by the ears, a subsonic drone that signaled the movement of heavy mass through a silent void. The visual landscape had shed all remaining vestiges of complexity. The jagged rocks of the past, the blackened stumps of the burnt woods, the twisted branches of the swamp, all were gone, erased by the overwhelming authority of the ice. The world was now composed of only two elements: the deep, translucent blue of the glacier beneath and the star-studded obsidian dome of the sky above. The horizon was a flat, sharp line where these two infinities met, a seam in the universe that seemed to stretch out forever. In the moonlight, the ice glowed with an internal luminescence, as if it held the memory of ancient light trapped deep within its strata. It was a cold light, a light without heat, casting no shadows because there was nothing standing to cast them. Inside the carriage, the Duchess sat in the center of the stillness. The transition to the glacier had completed her transformation. She was no longer a passenger enduring a journey. She had become a component of the sleigh, a fixture of velvet and wool fused to the wooden frame. The cold had ceased to be an external aggressor attacking her warmth. It was now the medium of her existence. Her body temperature had lowered, her heart rate had slowed to a rhythmic, reptilian crawl, and her breathing was so shallow it barely misted the air. She was in a state of suspended animation, a waking hibernation where the mind drifted untethered from the demands of the flesh. The lantern, which had been her faithful companion through the forest and the gorge, was finally dying. The old reservoir was empty, the wick burning down to charred nub. The flame sputtered, gasping for fuel. It shrank to a tiny blue bead, then flared yellow one last time, a desperate, silent shout against the dark, before winking out completely. The darkness that followed was not sudden, it was an acceptance. The artificial light had been an intrusion, a noisy yellow stain on the purity of the night. Now that it was gone, the true light of the winter could enter. The moonlight flooded the cabin, turning the interior into a silver-gray chamber. The red velvet turned to slate, the brown fur turned to ash. The Duchess's face, reflected in the darkened glass, was a pale moon in itself, serene and unmoving. With the loss of the lantern, the passage of time lost its last marker. There was no flickering shadow to count, no changing level of oil to observe. There was only the eternal present. The sleigh moved, yet it stayed in the same place. On a featureless plane of ice, motion is relative. Without a tree to pass, without a rock to leave behind, the sensation of forward momentum dissolved. They were traveling at speed, yet they were motionless. It was the paradox of the void. The Duchess accepted this paradox. She understood that she was not going to a place, she was simply going. The act of going was the destination. The horses were now dark silhouettes against the blue ice, phantom shapes that pulled without effort. Their breathing had quieted, or perhaps the acoustics of the glacier swallowed the sound. They moved in perfect unison, a single organism with 8 legs, driven by the memory of a road that no longer existed. They were ghost horses, spirits of the tundra, tirelessly drawing the black box through the endless night. The Duchess watched their rhythmic gait through the frost-free patch of the window. Up, down, up, down. It was a mechanical motion, devoid of will, fueled by the cold itself. The cold here was absolute. It was the temperature of deep space. It did not bite, it stopped. It stopped the decay of wood. It stopped the rust of iron. It stopped the aging of cells. The Duchess felt preserved. She felt like a flower pressed between the pages of a heavy book, flattened and dried and kept safe for eternity. The numbness in her limbs was total. She could not feel where her boots ended and the floor began. She could not feel where her cloak ended and the seat began. She was continuous with the carriage. She was the carriage. She gazed at the interior of the door, now illuminated only by the spectral moonlight. The details she had studied for hours, the scratch, the latch, the grain, were now washed out, reduced to subtle variations in tone. The world was a charcoal drawing that had been smudged by a heavy thumb, the lines softened, the edges blurred. The visual field was simplifying, reducing itself to the essentials. Light, dark, form, void. Her eyes remained open, but her vision was turned inward. She was seeing the landscape of her own mind, which had become a mirror of the landscape outside. Vast, empty, silent, cold. The sound of the runners on the glacier changed pitch again. It dropped to a lower register, a deep, resonant thrum that sounded like a cello bowed by a slow hand. The ice here was thicker, older. They were passing over the heart of the glacier, where the ice was miles deep. Below them lay eons of frozen history, dust from ancient volcanoes, pollen from extinct flowers, air bubbles from a time before humanity, all locked away in the blue vault. The sleigh was skimming the surface of a library of time. The Duchess felt the weight of that history supporting her. She was riding on the back of the ages. A gentle wind began to blow across the ice, not a gale, but a steady stream of heavy air flowing down from the high peaks. It didn't shake the carriage, it simply flowed around it, aerodynamic and smooth. It whispered against the glass a soft, sibilant language. SSSSSS, hush, SSSSSS, hush. It was the sound of the world sleeping, the sound of the atmosphere settling. The Duchess matched her breathing to the whisper, in on the SSSSSS, out on the hush. She was breathing with the planet. She thought of the title of her journey, The Sleigh Ride to Nowhere. It had seemed like a curse when she departed, a sentence of exile, but now in the heart of the blue night she understood it was a gift. Nowhere was a sanctuary. Somewhere meant expectations, arrivals, greetings, noise, heat, change. Nowhere meant stasis. Nowhere meant peace. To be nowhere was to be free from the tyranny of location. She was not in the north or the south or the east or the west. She was in the center of the zero. The frost on the window had stopped growing. The air was now too dry to support even the formation of crystals. The glass was clear again, a dark portal looking out onto the infinite flat. The view was hypnotic in its monotony. Blue ice, black sky, white stars, repeat. Blue ice, black sky, white stars, repeat. It was a loop that could run forever. The Duchess watched it scroll past, a moving wallpaper of eternity. She felt no boredom. Boredom required a desire for something else to happen. She had no desires left. She was content with the loop. Her mind began to fragment, dissolving into the sensory experience. She was no longer a duchess with a history and a name. She was a point of consciousness perceiving the cold. She was the feeling of the heavy wool. She was the sound of the runner. She was the smell of the ozone. She was the sight of the moon. The ego melted away, leaving only the witness. The witness sat in the corner of the carriage, silent and attentive, watching the movie of the night play out. The sleigh began a very gradual, almost imperceptible turn. It was banking slowly to the left, carving a wide arc on the glacier. They were not heading toward a specific point, they were circling, spiraling slowly inward toward the center of the ice field. The motion was soothing, a gentle gravitational pull that pressed her slightly deeper into the corner. The circle was the perfect shape, no beginning, no end, just the round, continuous journey. She imagined the tracks they were leaving behind. Two thin, silver lines etched into the blue ice, a geometry of travel. But on this hard surface, the tracks would be faint, shallow. The wind would polish them away within the hour. The sleigh left no permanent mark. It passed like a thought, existing only in the moment of its passage. This impermanence was comforting. To leave no trace was to be a ghost, and ghosts could not be hurt. Ghosts could not be cold. Ghosts simply were. The sensation of time expanded until it encompassed everything. A second felt like an hour felt like a second. It was all the same duration. The ride had always been happening. The ride would always be happening. The memory of the manner of the fire of the departure, those were just dreams. The reality was the sleigh. This box was the universe. The coachman was the pilot of the universe. The horses were the energy of the universe. And she was the passenger of the universe. She felt a deep heaviness in her eyelids. It was not the heaviness of sleepiness, but the heaviness of stone. She let them close halfway. The world blurred into horizontal bands of color, dark band for the roof, gray band for the window, dark band for the door. It was an abstract painting of the night. She watched the bands vibrate gently with the motion of the sleigh. It was a visual lullaby. The silence deepened. The hum of the runners seemed to merge with the silence, becoming a texture of the quiet rather than a disruption of it. The wind whisper faded. The horses' hooves were soundless on the smooth ice. The world was muting itself, turning down the volume knob until it reached zero. The Duchess sat in the acoustic void. She could hear the blood moving in her ears, a slow, oceanic swish. Swish, swish, swish. It was the sound of her own life, quiet and persistent, flowing through the frozen landscape of her body. She thought about the concept of waiting. She was waiting for nothing. There was no event scheduled, no arrival time, no dawn. The night here lasted for 6 months or perhaps forever. The sun had forgotten this place, and that was fine. The sun was loud. The sun was bright. The sun demanded things to grow and change. The moon only asked them to reflect. She was reflecting. She was a mirror in the dark. The cold had reached her core. It wasn't painful. It was a clarifying force. It crystallized her thoughts, stripping away the unnecessary emotions. Fear, regret, longing, these were warm emotions, soft and messy. They froze and shattered in this temperature, leaving behind only a hard, diamond-like clarity. She knew who she was. She was the lady of the ice. She was the traveler of the endless plain. The sleigh glided over a fissure in the ice, a deep crack that glowed with a darker blue from the depths. The runners bridged the gap smoothly, a brief moment of suspension over the abyss. The Duchess looked down into the crack as they passed. It went down forever, a shaft into the heart of the world. She felt a pull, a gravity from the deep, but the sleigh carried her on. The momentum of the horizontal journey overcame the pull of the vertical depth. They kept moving, always moving. The fur rug felt like a part of her skin now. She couldn't tell where her hand ended and the bare pelt began. They were fused, a chimera of human and animal adapted for the winter. She huddled inside the amalgamation of layers, a kernel of life inside a shell of dead things. The shell protected the kernel honored the shell. The moon moved a fraction of an inch across the sky, or perhaps the earth turned. It was the only clock hand left. The shadow of the window frame shifted a millimeter on the seat. The Duchess tracked the movement. It was a glacial pace, a pace that mocked the frantic hurry of the human world. Here, things happened in geological time. She adjusted her internal metronome to match it. Tick. Tock. She was tired, a profound existential tiredness that went beyond the need for sleep. It was a need for cessation, a need to stop being a person and start being a thing, a rock, a block of ice, a shadow. The sleigh ride offered her that chance. It allowed her to be passive, to be carried, to be inert. The rhythmic sway of the carriage became even gentler. The surface of the glacier was perfectly flat here. The rocking stopped, the vibrations smoothed out. It felt like flying, gliding through the ether. The Duchess floated in her corner. She was weightless. The gravity of the earth had forgotten her. She was drifting in the dark blue space. She listened to the silence one last time. It was a perfect, spherical silence. It held her. It comforted her. It told her that everything was all right, that the cold was natural, that the dark was safe, that the journey was the answer. She let her head rest fully against the velvet wing of the seat. The fabric was cold, hard, and welcoming. She closed her eyes. The afterimage of the blue ice remained, a glowing horizontal line in the darkness of her mind. She watched the line. It was the horizon. It was the road. It was the timeline of the night. The sleigh moved on. The horses pulled. The coachman sat. The runners hummed. The sleigh ride to nowhere continued its eternal loop across the roof of the world, carrying the exiled Duchess into the deepest, quietest, coldest drift of the history. There was no end. There was only the ride, and the ride was everything. The wind whispered a final benediction against the glass. The ice sang its single, high note. The night wrapped its heavy arms around the wooden box, and the Duchess slept, eyes open behind closed lids, watching the endless blue snow slide by, forever and ever in the vintage pastel dark of the silent, frozen world.